Hey everybody, this is chapter 9 of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, volume 2. The two Trotskyisms confront Stalinism. This chapter is chapter 9, and it's titled Legends of the Fall. It happens to be the first chapter of part 3 of the book, which is titled Angels, Devils, Political Folklore, and Historical Falsification. The first piece is titled excuse me, sneezed right into the microphone. Oh, it's gonna be one of those days. Sorry. It's titled Resisting an Assault on Marxism is the first piece. It's by Joseph Hansen and George Novak of the Socialist Workers' Party, and it's from 1942. Let me see if if it had an original title. This is an introduction to In Defense of Marxism, a selection of polemics from 1939 to 40, published by the Socialist Workers' Party in 1942. So it would appear that this is an introduction to In Defense of Marxism. So here we are. 1. For more than 40 years, Leon Trotsky defended and developed the ideas and methods of Marxism. In early manhood, Trotsky undertook their defense against the Tsarist regime and the whole bourgeois world. During the First World War, Trotsky defended revolutionary internationalism against the social patriots and revisionists of the Second International. In the Russian Revolution, side by side with Lenin, Trotsky defended the program of Bolshevism against the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. After the victorious October 1917 revolution, as the leading Soviet propagandist, Trotsky defended Marxist principles in the field of political polemics as vigorously and brilliantly as he had had the defense of the worker state on the military fronts. With Lenin, Trotsky founded the Third International to spread the ideas of Marxism throughout the world. Trotsky's greatest battles in defense of Marxism came after Lenin's death. When the first signs of bureaucratic reaction appeared within the Russian Communist Party, Trotsky organized the left opposition, which sought to maintain the Bolshevik program against the backsliding towards petty bourgeois politics of the Stalin-Zinoviev-Kamenev bloc. Despite his deportation to Alma-Ata, which is in, I believe, Kazakhstan, Trotsky continued the struggle of the Russian communist left opposition against the growing revisionist tendencies of the degenerating Stalinist clique. In exile in Turkey, Trotsky organized the communist left opposition on an international scale. When the Third International capitulated to fascism without a struggle in Germany in 1933, Trotsky founded the Fourth International to carry on the struggle for socialism. During the last decade of his life, Trotsky defended Marxism against fascism, against bourgeois democratic political opinion, against all varieties of petty bourgeois politics, and the virulent Stalinism of the Third International and the social reformism of the Second International to impotent centrism, ultra-leftism, and anarcho-syndicalism. There's no significant anti-Marxist tendency which did not have to reckon with Trotsky, and which Trotsky did not analyze in Trotsky's writings. In the universal reaction culminating in the Second World War, Trotsky stood forth as the foremost champion of revolutionary socialism. At the beginning of the Second World War, Trotsky was again called upon to give battle in defense of Marxism. This time the struggle took place in the ranks of the American section of Trotsky's own Fourth International. Unbalanced by the impact of the war in Europe and the pressure of alien class influences and ideas, a group of leaders within the Socialist Workers' Party made what Trotsky characterized as, quote, an attempt to reject, disqualify, and overthrow the theoretical foundations, the political principles, and organizational methods of our movement, end quote. They and their followers failed. They failed because Trotsky, basing himself upon the experiences of the Bolshevik Party and the Bolshevik Party's predecessors, had forewarned the Trotskyist movement that the outbreak of another imperialist war would inevitably precipitate a crisis in its ranks, that under the onslaught of bourgeois public opinion, the petty bourgeois elements in the party would become disoriented, that the proletarian wing must prepare itself against the dangers of this degeneration. They failed because when that crisis did break out, Trotsky detected its first symptoms, diagnosed the nature of the disease, and prognosticated its further development. They failed because Trotsky was able to lead the proletarian majority in the ensuing factional conflict. This volume is the most valuable product of that struggle which tested and tempered the ranks of our party. Here are many of Trotsky's most mature contributions to Marxist thought, to his last battle in defense of Marxism. Trotsky devoted the best energies of the last year of his life. He wrote the final item in his collection on August 17, 1940, 3 days before the Stalinist assassins struck him down. 2. As Trotsky demonstrated in his article From a Scratch to the Danger of Gangrene, the elements of a petty bourgeois deviation had long been germinating within the American Trotskyist movement. This tendency did not dare assert itself in an organized and open political shape until it was impelled to do so by the events leading up to and directly following the outbreak of the Second World War. The immediate occasion for the formation of the petty bourgeois opposition and the petty bourgeois opposition's assault upon Marxism revolved around the question of the USSR. This was no accident. Since 17th of November 1917, what's up, Teddy? That's what I've named the frog, or toad, or whatever the hell it is that lives in this umbrella. Teddy. Teddy the toad. I don't know. Maybe he's not a toad. I don't know, where the hell am I? Sorry. The immediate occasion for the formation of the petty bourgeois opposition and the petty bourgeois opposition's assault upon Marxism revolved around the question of the USSR. This was no accident. Since the 7th of November 1917, the question of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state, which is the Russian Revolution's creation, has drawn a sharp dividing line through the labor movement of all countries. The attitude taken towards the Soviet Union throughout all these years has been the decisive criterion separating the genuine revolutionary tendency from all shades and degrees of waverers, backsliders, and capitulators to the pressure of the bourgeois world, the Mensheviks, social democrats, anarchists, and syndicalists, centrists, Stalinists. The development of the discussion quickly revealed that all the fundamental issues were involved. On the 22nd of August 1939 came the announcement of the Soviet-German Pact, whereupon a great wave of anti-Soviet propaganda swept through the, quote, democracies, end quote. The petty bourgeois wing of the Socialist Workers' Party was shaken to the core. The same day at the meeting of the Socialist Workers' Party Political Committee, Stratum made the following motion, quote, that the next meeting of the Political Committee, beginning with a discussion of our estimate of the Stalin-Hitler Pact as related to our evaluation of the Soviet state and the perspectives for the future, end quote. Shachtman still affirmed defense of the USSR, but Shachtman's motion indicated that Shachtman was now approaching James Burnham's views on the nature of the USSR, which Shachtman had previously opposed. In several documents written before Burnham, like Shachtman, a member of the political committee, had already questioned the fundamental principle of the Fourth International, that the Soviet Union is a workers' state which, although degenerated under the Stalinist regime, must be unconditionally defended against imperialist attack by the world working class. Thus, the pact which has ushered in the war likewise ushered in our inter-party crisis. A week later, the Second World War began. The pent-up petty bourgeois tendency now broke the bonds. At the September 3rd Political Committee meeting, Burnham made a motion to convene a full session of the National Committee the following week and to place on its agenda a reconsideration of the Russian question. The majority agreed and demanded that the opposition first put its new ideas in written form. The majority also asked for sufficient time to invite Trotsky to acquaint us with Trotsky's views. Characteristic of the opposition's hostility to Trotsky from the outset was the fact that the opposition voted against this proposal. On the 5th of September, Burnham submitted his document on the character of the war for the plenum meeting of the National Committee. Its essence is in the following sentences, quote, "It is impossible to regard the Soviet Union as a worker state in any sense whatsoever. ... Soviet intervention, in the war, will be wholly subordinated to the general imperialist character of the conflict as a whole, and will be in no sense a defense of the remains of the socialist economy," end quote. A week later, in the letter with which the volume begins, Trotsky began laying bare the real implications of Burnham's doctrine, quote, "that all the revolutionary potentialities of the world proletariat are exhausted, that the socialist movement is bankrupt, and that the old capitalism is transforming the old capitalism self into, quote, bureaucratic collectivism," end quote, with a new exploiting class, end quote. Trotsky expanded upon Burnham's position in his first important document of the faction struggle, the USSR in War, which arrived in time for discussion at the plenum. Since the petty bourgeois opposition had not yet openly constituted itself as a faction, Trotsky utilized arguments similar to theirs, which had been advanced by the Italian ex-communist Bruno Rizzi and others, said Bruno R. and others, and developed their logical conclusions. This document constituted a stern warning to Burnham and Burnham's followers that, in challenging the program of the Fourth International on the Russian question, Burnham and his followers thereby actually challenged the basic postulates of scientific socialism. Three different groupings came together in the petty bourgeois opposition. Burnham was its ideological leader, expressing most clearly its anti-Marxist character. Aberne's clique ostensibly agreed with Trotsky's views and disclaimed Burnham's. Shachtman, occupying an intermediate position, was beset with doubts and reservations which Shachtman applied indiscriminately to both Trotsky's and Burnham's positions. These last two tendencies in the bloc, those of Aberne and Shachtman, were not yet ready to take the stand on Burnham's ground. They still pretended allegiance to the program of the Fourth International. How did they get around these contradictions in their position in order to form a common faction with Burnham? They conspired with Burnham to suppress his real views. Then they found a common formula for their unprincipled combination by refusing to consider basic principles and demanding that the discussion be limited to immediate, quote, concrete, end quote, issues. At the plenum, which convened on the 30th of September, when the time came for Burnham to speak by Burnham's document, Burnham blandly announced that he had withdrawn it. Instead, Burnham's attorney, Shachtman, produced a resolution at the joint platform of the opposition, which attempted to evade and postpone the discussion of the fundamental dispute on the class nature of the Soviet state by limiting the struggle to, quote, immediate answers to the concrete questions raised by the Hitler-Stalin Pact, end quote. The resolution nevertheless failed to adhere to its own claims, own aims, and conditions. The Red Army invasion of Poland was termed an act of, quote, imperialist policy, end quote, which necessitated a, quote, revision of our previous concept of the, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, end quote. The Aberne clique exposed its unprincipled character by voting for both Shachtman's resolution and the motion that the party majority to, quote, reaffirm our basic analysis of the nature of the Soviet state and the role of Stalinism, end quote, and to, quote, endorse the political conclusions, end quote, of Trotsky's The USSR in War. From all appearances at this stage of their flight from Marxism, the opposition simply differed with Trotsky's interpretation of certain events and the, quote, organizational manners, end quote, of the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party, which they attributed to Cannon. Both Trotsky and his co-thinkers discerned the anti-Marxist tendency concealed within this entire unprincipled combination. The ideological parentage of Shachtman's resolution was clear. Its question mark over the class nature of the Soviet Union was a bridge leading to Burnham's answer. That answer was foreshadowed in these characterizations. This is a weird sentence. That answer was foreshadowed in the characterization of the Red Army's actions as, quote, acts of imperialist policy, end quote. As Trotsky explained in Trotsky's first letter to Sherman Stanley, and in Trotsky's article again and once more on the nature of the USSR, quote, imperialism, end quote, is a term Marxists reserve for the expansionist politics of monopoly capitalism. The plenum accordingly condemned the resolution of the opposition, quote, as an attempt in part to revise the fundamental position of the party, and in part to shield the position of those who aim at revision of our policy on the question of the Soviet Union in a fundamental sense, end quote, and accepted the position put forward in Trotsky's article, The USSR in War. The opposition organized on a national scale and sought support in other national sections of the Fourth International. As a series of membership meetings in the as a series of membership meetings in New York, the majority continued the majority's efforts to bring the fundamental issues to the surface. In his next article, again and once more on the nature of the USSR, Trotsky dealt more specifically and sharply with the arguments being circulated by Burnham's followers, warning those who care to heed, quote, "If we are to speak of a revision of Marx, it is in reality the revision of those comrades who project a new type of state, quote, non-bourgeois and, quote, non-worker," end quote, end quote. Trotsky. Stenographs of a speech by James P. Cannon in support of the Fourth International position, and of a speech by Shachtman which tried to cover up Burnham and maintain the highly unstable position of his plenum resolution, were sent to Trotsky. Whereupon, upon receipt of the two stenographs, Trotsky immediately dictated a letter to Shachtman, answering in detail the revisionist ideas which Shachtman had up to this time tried to palm off as being in agreement with Trotsky's The USSR in War. The majority printed articles in the internal bulletin of the Socialist Workers' Party during the weeks following, clarifying the deep-going character of the differences, but the opposition stubbornly refused to accept battle on this principled basis. Trotsky decided that the time had come to cut through the rationalizations of the minority and to open up the abscess from which the infection was flowing. Burnham's ideological leadership, in the famous first paragraph of his article, "A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party," Burnham declared, quote, "It is necessary to call things by their right names. Now that the position of both factions in the struggle have become determined with complete clearness, it must be said that the minority of the National Committee is leading a typically petty bourgeois tendency. Like any petty bourgeois group inside the socialist movement, the present opposition is characterized by the following features: a disdainful attitude towards theory and an inclination toward eclecticism, disrespect for the tradition of their own organization, anxiety for personal, quote, independence, end quote, at the expense of anxiety for objective truth, nervousness instead of consistency, readiness to jump from one position to another, lack of understanding of revolutionary centralism, and hostility toward revolutionary centralism, and finally inclination to substitute clique ties and personal relationships for party discipline, ... end quote. These words cut like a scalpel. Excuse me. That last quote was from Trotsky. The article, "A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party." These words cut like a scalpel through the pretensions of the mentality. The full implication of the factional struggle had now been posed point blank by the leader of the Fourth International. The article, mainly directed against Burnham, brought forward before the entire Fourth International the question of Burnham's method in arriving at his theoretical and political conclusions. Trotsky showed that Burnham and Shachtman's rejection of dialectics and their substitution of the pragmatic method had inexorably led to incorrect political conclusions. For the benefit of workers unacquainted with dialectical materialism, Trotsky outlined the elementary ideas of the method in lucid terms. Trotsky followed up his analysis of the petty bourgeois opposition with an open letter to Comrade Burnham. This was designed as a deliberate challenge to force Burnham into the open and compel him to defend his real views. Burnham did not dare remain silent any longer under Trotsky's concentrated fire for fear of losing influence over his personal following. Moreover, Trotsky's thrust had hit him in the vitals. As Burnham subsequently confessed in his letter of resignation, Trotsky dealt with the very beliefs that were determining Burnham's course, of which Burnham was conscious long before his public break with the Fourth International. Why did not a large part of the opposition leave Burnham and return to Marxism at this point? The answer can be found in the social pressure bearing down upon them as the war encircled the globe. This was the period when Baron Mannerheim's, quote, "poor little Finland," end quote, was the object of commiseration, and the Soviet Union the object of hatred in England and the United States. Shachtman came out in defense of Burnham in an open letter attacking Trotsky, in line with Burnham's contention that the method of dialectical materialism, the message impelled by Trotsky, was of no use in answering the political problems of the day. It utilized the Polish and Finnish events to cast aspersions upon Trotsky's interpretation of current events. Trotsky answered Shachtman from a scratch to the danger of gangrene. In this article, Trotsky's attack on Burnham, always his main attack throughout the fight, is supplemented by a powerful and devastating analysis of Shachtman's past and his role as Burnham's attorney. Burnham now came out in Burnham's own defense. Burnham replied to Trotsky's open letter with Burnham's notorious document, Science and Style, which has been appended to this volume. Science and Style was the crassest expression of the anti-Marxist character and tendency of the opposition. Trotsky's success in smoking Burnham out and forcing Burnham to divulge his real views was the turning point in the struggle. With Burnham's answer, the struggle became clearly defined for the whole Fourth International. Here was empirical proof that the fight centered between revisionism and Marxism. Here was empirical proof that the fight centered between revisionism and Marxism! Burnham's document, which appeared on the crest of the wave of Anglo-American war hysteria against the Soviet Union, rendered explicit what Trotsky and others with a dialectical understanding of the deep structures of the party had seen as implicit for a long time. Trotsky had achieved his main aim, to prove to the Fourth International that the heavy proportion of petty bourgeois elements in its membership has thrown the Socialist Workers' Party into a crisis with the outbreak of the Second World War, and that this crisis concerned the most fundamental propositions of scientific socialism. When Science and Style appeared, Trotsky explicitly stated in his letter of February 23rd, quote, "The abscess is open. Aborn and Shachtman can no longer repeat that Aborn and Shachtman wish only to discuss Finland and Cannon a bit. Aborn and Shachtman can no longer play blind man's bluff with Marxism and with the Fourth International. Should the Socialist Workers' Party remain in the tradition of Marx, Engels, Franz Mehring, Lenin, and Rosa Luxemburg, a tradition which Burnham proclaims, quote, reactionary, end quote, or should the Socialist Workers' Party accept Burnham's conceptions, which are only a belated reproduction of pre-Marxian petty bourgeois socialism, end quote?" Trotsky invited Aborn and Shachtman to speak up, quote, "What do you think of Burnham's, quote, science and of Burnham's, quote, style? ... Comrade Burnham's and Shachtman, you have the floor," end quote. Aborn and Shachtman remained silent. When Aborn and Shachtman refused to disavow Burnham and Burnham's doctrines, including his, quote, science and his, quote, style, it became obvious that Aborn and Shachtman were preparing to split from the Fourth International. The majority endeavored to maintain unity, acting under the conviction that the unity of the Revolutionary Party and the inculcation of party patriotism are among its most precious assets. The majority likewise had two objectives. One, to keep wavering elements in the minority under the maximum influence of our program. Two, to prove conclusively to the other sections of the Fourth International that matters come to a split, the responsibilities of the split rested wholly with the minority. That if matters came to a split, the responsibilities of the split rested wholly with the minority. Quote, "We must do everything in order to convince also the other sections that the majority exhausted all the possibilities in favor of unity," end quote. Trotsky explained. Quote, "The happenings in the Socialist Workers' Party have now a great international importance, ... You must act not only on the basis of your subjective appreciations, as correct as your subjective appreciations may be, but on the basis of objective facts available to everyone," end quote. Trotsky. All the objective facts demonstrate that the minority's break with Marxism was the primary reason for the split. The discussion, which continued for more than 6 months, was the fullest ever undertaken in our movement. There was complete freedom from every viewpoint to express that viewpoint self. The opposition was given every opportunity to win a majority and leadership in the party, quote, even as an eventual minority, end quote. Trotsky wrote to the majority on December 19th, quote, you should, in my opinion, remain disciplined and loyal towards the party as a whole. It is extremely important for the education and genuine party patriotism, about the necessity for which Cannon wrote me one time very correctly, end quote. At the convention where Trotsky's followers succeeded in winning a majority of their party to their position, they did not appeal to the minority from the party, deprive them of a share in the leadership, of responsible posts, or demand that they renounce their beliefs. On the contrary, representation corresponding to their actual strength was offered on all the bodies of the party. Only observance of the principle of democratic centralism was demanded, that the minority abide loyally by the discussion of the majority and confine its activity to further attempts to win the party to its position. The convention majority even agreed to a continuation of the discussion in the internal bulletin. The conduct of the majority in this respect, guided at every step by Trotsky, serves as a model of correct Bolshevik tactics in building the proletarian party. Trotsky draws the balance sheet of this aspect of the struggle in his article, Petty Bourgeois Moralists and the Proletarian Party. At the Socialist Workers' Party convention, which concluded on the 5th of April 1940, the majority of the party reaffirmed its support of the Fourth International Program. On the 16th of April, the political committee met and moved, quote, that the committee accept the convention decisions and obligate itself to carry them out in a disciplined manner, end quote. The minority bloc leaders refused to vote for this motion. Instead of expelling them as would have been wholly justified, the majority still waited. The record was made clear to the other sections of the Fourth International to the very end. Burnham and his followers were simply suspended until they would indicate, quote, their intention to comply with the convention decisions, end quote. The minority, however, had already rented a separate headquarters. They set up a separate organization, which they named the, quote, Workers' Party, began printing a public newspaper, and stole the party's theoretical organ, the New International. These actions of the minority are characterized in Trotsky's article, Petty Bourgeois Moralist and the Proletarian Party, which, together with the balance sheet of the Finnish events, tersely sums up the political lessons of the struggle. Such was the sequence of events in the factional struggle from August 1939, when the minority leaders started to attack and revise the Fourth International Program, to April 1940, when the minority broke away from the Socialist Workers' Party. Three. Burnham was far from an isolated figure. Burnham not only had followers inside the Socialist Workers' Party, Burnham had a host of kindred spirits outside amongst the ex-radical petty bourgeois intellectuals. Most prominent amongst them were Sidney Hook, Max Eastman, Louis Corey, Louis Hacker. These forerunners of Burnham had already revised Marxism all along the line, beginning with its theoretical foundations and ending with its politics. They constituted the American section of an international brotherhood of renegades from Marxism, headed by Boris Souverin, Victor Serge, and Bruno Rizzi. Etc. As Trotsky pointed out in A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party, Burnham and Shachtman had endeavored to analyze this tendency in an article in the January 1939 issue of the International, Intellectuals in Retreat. Their analysis proved inadequate for the same reason that later induced them to join this procession of fugitives from the revolutionary movement. Hook, Eastman, Corey blazed the trail for Burnham and Shachtman. Indeed, the petty bourgeois opposition drew their arguments and ideas and received moral encouragement and inspiration from this, quote, League of Abandoned Hopes, end quote, which they had previously criticized. Most of these renegades had begun their careers as revisionists with a philosophical struggle against materialist dialectics. To conceal the extent and profundity of their opposition to Marxism from themselves as well as from others, one and all protested that their differences were, quote, purely philosophical, end quote, and that such abstract differences in theory need not affect their specific political ideas and actions. Logic and philosophy in general, they held, had no necessary connection with politics. Consequently, they argued, the Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism had no bearing on concrete political parties, programs, and struggles. Burnham and Shachtman first enunciated this attitude in their article Intellectuals in Retreat. Burnham and Shachtman jointly maintained during the faction struggle. maintained this attitude during the faction struggle. Burnham disclosed his irreconcilable hostility to Marxist theory and science and style when Burnham accused the Trotsky of dragging dialectics into the political controversy as a, quote, red herring, end quote. Quote, there is no sense at all, end quote, declares Burnham, quote, in which dialectics ... is fundamental in politics, none at all, end quote, Burnham. Burnham and Shachtman had simply taken over this position from Eastman and Hooke. Eastman had long contended that Marxism should purge Marxism self of dialectical materialism, which he alleged was nothing but a remnant of religion and Hegelian metaphysics, and adopt his, quote, common sense, end quote, approach. Hooke, echoing these arguments, scoffed at the, quote, fancied political implications of the doctrine of dialectical materialism, end quote. This divorce of logic from politics, this rejection of dialectical materialism as the theoretical foundation of Marxism, is alien to Marxist thought and tradition. Marxism is a unified, consistent, and comprehensive world conception. Its method of thought, the materialist dialectic, is an integral part of Marxism's doctrines. Marx and Engels and their disciples arrived at their political conclusions and formulated their political programs by means of this method. Trotsky said, quote, ... Marxism without the dialectic, end quote, is, quote, a clock without a spring, end quote. Trotsky several times in these pages defined dialectics as the logic of evolution. It is the highest form of logic yet developed by the scientific thought. The materialist dialectic, as distinguished from Hegel's idealistic dialectics, is essentially the logic of revolutionary change. The principal laws of this logic rationally explain not only the course of gradual changes in natural, social, and mental processes, but also the sharp breaks and qualitative leaps whereby things are transformed into their own opposites. Why are bourgeois thinkers repelled from the materialist dialectic? Mainly because as a logic of history it recognizes the seeds and roots of social revolutions within gradual changes in social life. At a certain stage in the accumulation of these changes, a qualitative leap occurs, a break with the past, a revolution. Thus, according to the dialectic, social and political revolutions are not accidental aberrations or avoidable detours in history, but materially caused and lawfully determined stages in the cycle of development of class societies. Finally, and to bourgeois ideologists and their petty bourgeois shadows, this is its most horrifying feature. The materialist dialectic explains the logical evolution of the class struggle of our own epoch. It demonstrates why progressive capitalism becomes transmuted into reactionary monopoly capitalism with its imperialist politics and wars. It demonstrates the inevitability of the overthrow of monopoly capitalism by the social revolution of the international working class, and the transformation of dying capitalism into living socialism. The materialist dialectic cannot be severed from social life or political thought because the materialist dialectic formulates those general laws of social movement which give rise to the class struggle, govern its course, and determine its outcome. When Lenin remarked that Trotsky in these writings reiterated, quote, there can be no revolutionary practice without revolutionary theory, end quote, they meant specifically, there can be no consistent revolutionary proletarian politics without the materialist dialectic, which is the essence of scientific socialism. This is the key to the significance of materialist dialectics to the revolutionary socialist movement and to the opposition materialist dialectics arouses among such enemies of that movement as the renegade petty bourgeois doctrinaires. To accept the logic of Marxism, to study, master, and use the logic of Marxism, is to embrace and advance the revolution. Indifference or opposition to the logical foundations of Marxism is consistently developed, most often led, as it did in the case of Burnham, Shachtman, Hooke, Eastman, and other high priests of, quote, common sense, end quote, to a repudiation of Marxism, not simply in philosophical theory but in political practice. Their desertion of socialism and a prostration before bourgeois thought was implicit from the beginning, as Trotsky foresaw in their hostility towards materialist dialectics. The antagonism to Marxism, which they first manifested in the apparently unrelated field of philosophical controversy, reached fruition in their political program. Obviously, logic and philosophy are not so far removed from practical reality as they claimed. History itself speaks most strongly against such attempts to split Marxist method from practical politics. Under Lenin and Trotsky, the Bolshevik Party released realized in social and political action what Marx and Engels, with the aid of their dialectical method, had explained and forecast in the Communist Manifesto and Capital. What the Bolsheviks proved in the most positive, practical manner in the Russian Revolution of 1917, the harmonious integration of Marxist theory and revolutionary action, Burnham, Hooke, and Eastman have amply proved in a negative way by their own renegacy. Today, these deserters openly espouse bourgeois ideas in politics as well as in philosophy, and from the camp of the class enemy, they conduct a spiteful struggle against the movement with which they once identified themselves. Burnham's flight into the camp of the bourgeoisie was the most precipitate and complete of all. 1 month after Burnham and his followers departed from the Trotskyist movement, Burnham disdainfully resigned from Burnham's new, quote, party, end quote. Burnham's resignation and Burnham's letter of apology to his dupes involuntarily confirmed all that Trotsky had said about Burnham in the course of the controversy. This letter is republished in the appendix for the information and enlightenment of students of the dialectic. A few months later, Burnham expanded his ideas on world politics in a book, The Managerial Revolution. The Managerial Revolution enjoyed wide popularity in big business, bureaucratic, and petty bourgeois intellectual circles until Hitler's attack upon the Soviet Union exploded its chief, quote, concrete, end quote, political thesis, that Hitler and Stalin, the chief representatives of the future managerial society, had joined forces in the August 1939 pact to, quote, drive death wounds into capitalism, end quote. From the theoretical standpoint, this wretched book was essentially literary preparation for a nascent fascist movement in this country. The logic of contradiction revenged itself upon Burnham, and thus this, quote, witch doctor, end quote, as Trotsky called Burnham, who would not on logical grounds admit the inevitability of anything, and especially the inevitability of socialism, ended up preaching the inevitability of the totalitarian state. Burnham's orphans have also gone from bad to worse. A month and a half before the split convention, the majority predicted that, quote, because of the minority's internal contradictions, end quote, the group would disintegrate, quote, part going over to the bourgeoisie, part moving over to the, quote, sidelines, end quote, and part returning to Marxism, ... end quote. This prediction has since in large measure been fulfilled. A section of the minority, realizing that they had been deluded by Burnham's leadership, returned to the Socialist Workers' Party. Many others have entirely given up any pretense of political activity. Following Burnham, a group of youth inclining towards social patriotism left the minority to join the moribund Socialist Party. Those remaining act as political parasites attempting to masquerade as, quote, Trotskyist, end quote, while defaming Trotsky and rejecting Trotsky's most fundamental ideas. This remnant, however, is steadily zigzagging in the direction already taken by Burnham. Since the split, their program has undergone a series of changes along the line of political degeneration. Revising the Marxist theory of the state, they have officially adopted Burnham's viewpoint that the Soviet Union is no longer a degenerated worker state, but a, quote, bureaucratic collectivist state, end quote. Neither capitalist nor proletarian in character, they have abandoned the defense of the Soviet Union in the Soviet Union's hour of mortal peril. Since Pearl Harbor, they have abandoned support of China's war against Japan and evade any clear statement of position on India's present struggle against British imperialism. Rejecting Trotsky's proletarian military policy, they have adopted a sectarian semi-pacifist attitude toward the military training of the working class. All these frenzied jumps from one position to another are given an extremely, quote, radical, end quote, coloration with quotations from Lenin thrown in for good measure. But Lenin himself long ago demonstrated that, quote, petty bourgeois revolutionism, end quote, is only the other side of the coin of petty bourgeois opportunism. As events unfold, the irreconcilable cleavage between the Trotskyists and these petty bourgeois pretenders reveals itself on every important issue. What appeared at the beginning of the struggle to be remote differences regarding the relations between logic and politics, with a slight dispute over the Russian question, has turned out to be a fundamental opposition in methods of thought, class theory, and political program. Section 4. The Trotskyist movement in the United States gained far more than it lost in the struggle and split with the petty bourgeois opposition. The proletarian majority of the party demonstrated in action its understanding of Marxism together with the proletarian majority's ability to defend these ideas. Since the split, it has become, in composition as well as in program, a genuine proletarian organization. In November-December 1941, the political and trade union leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party stood up in the capitalist court at Minneapolis, where they were on trial for, quote, sedition, end quote, and defended against the government of the American bourgeoisie, the same program with which they and Trotsky had defended since the petty bourgeois opposition. They now face prison terms for their refusal to recant. Since the trial, despite the war hysteria, the American Trotskyists have registered significant gains in membership. All the sections of the Fourth International which were able to learn of the struggle in the United States supported Trotsky's position. How well the Fourth International absorbed the lessons and methods of Marxism is provided by the Bolshevik-Leninist Party of India, which independently and without direct knowledge of the faction struggle of the documents written in that struggle, due to the war and British censorship, published a pamphlet, Whither the Soviet Union, which presents with absolute precision our position on the character of the worker state and the necessity for the worker state's unconditional defense. World events have confirmed Trotsky's analysis and revealed the utter bankruptcy of the minority's estimates. At that time, Trotsky warned of the impending assault by Hitler's armies and girded the class-conscious workers for the defense of the Soviet Union. Burnham held the position of the Soviet Union constituted ipso facto. Defense of the Soviet Union constituted ipso facto support of Hitlerism. As for their analyses of the Polish and Finnish events, Burnham's followers are the last ones in the world today who want to speak about that. The petty bourgeois bloc counted on exploiting the theoretical deficiencies of our party, which reflected the traditional theoretical backwardness of the American working class. By repelling this assault upon dialectical materialism and the political program flowing from it, the Socialist Workers' Party thereby showed that it had taken a step forward in mastering the fundamental method of Marxism. This was just the beginning, even in our own ranks, of understanding the importance of the materialist dialectic, of studying the materialist dialectic, of using the materialist dialectic, of teaching the materialist dialectic to the advanced workers. Today in our party and in the Fourth International, this task remains among the foremost. Trotsky's writings during this factional struggle, gathered here in one volume, are an indispensable aid for accomplishing this great historical work. December 2nd, 1942. Again, this is an introduction to In Defense of Marxism, a selection of Trotsky's polemics from 1939 to 40, published by the Socialist Workers' Party in 1942. The next piece is titled, or labeled, Workers' Party, A Petty Bourgeois Tendency by Leon Trotsky. This was written in Coyoacán, where Trotsky lived in the suburb of Mexico City, August 7th, 1940, and published in the Fourth International, October 1940. Question: in your opinion, were there enough political differences between the majority and the minority to warrant a split? Okay, so this is an interview, I guess. Trotsky: here it is also necessary to consider the question dialectically, not mechanically. What does this terrible word, quote, dialectics, end quote, mean? The word dialectics means to consider things in things' development, not in things' static situation. If we take the political differences as those political differences are, we can say the political differences were not sufficient for a split, but if the political differences developed a tendency to turn away from the proletariat in the direction of petty bourgeois circles, then the same differences can have an absolutely different value, a different weight, if they are connected with a different social group. This is a very important point. We have the fact that the minority split away from us, in spite of all the measures taken by the majority not to split. This signifies that their inner social feeling was such that it is impossible for the minority to go together with us. The minority is a petty bourgeois tendency, not a proletarian. If you wish a new confirmation of this, we have an excellent example in the article of Dwight MacDonald. First of all, what characterizes a proletarian revolutionary? No one is obliged to participate in a revolutionary party, but if someone wants to participate in a revolutionary party, that participant considers the party seriously. If we dare to call the people for a revolutionary change of society, we carry a tremendous responsibility, which we must consider very seriously. And what is our theory but merely the tools of our action? These tools are our Marxist theory because up to the day we have not found better tools. A worker is not fantastic about tools. A worker is not fantastic about tools. If tools are the best tools the worker can get, he is careful with them. The worker does not abandon tools or demand fantastic non-existent tools. Burnham is an intellectual snob. Burnham picks up one party, abandons it, takes up another. A worker cannot do this. If a worker enters a revolutionary party, addresses the people, calls them for action, is the same as a general during a war. He must know where he is leading them. What would you think of a general who said he thought the guns were bad, that if it would be better to wait for 10 years until they had invented better guns, so everybody had better go home? That is the way Burnham reasons. So Burnham abandoned the party, but the unemployed remain, and the war remains. These things cannot be postponed. Therefore, it is only Burnham who has postponed his action. Dwight MacDonald is not a snob, but a bit stupid. I quote, "The intellectual, if the intellectual is to serve any useful function in society, must not deceive either himself or others, must not accept as good coin what the intellectual knows is counterfeit, must not forget in a moment of crisis that the intellectual, has learned over a period of years and decades," end quote. Dwight MacDonald. Absolutely correct. I quote again, quote, "Only if we meet the stormy and terrible years ahead with both skepticism and devotion, skepticism towards all theories, governments and social systems, devotion to the revolutionary fight of the masses, only then can we justify ourselves as intellectuals," end quote. Dwight MacDonald. Here is one of the leaders of the so-called, quote, Workers' Party. Here is one of the leaders of the so-called, quote, Workers, end quote, Party, who considers himself not a proletarian but a, quote, intellectual, end quote. He speaks of skepticism toward all theories. We prepared ourselves for this crisis by building a scientific method, and our method is Marxism. Then the crisis comes and Mr. MacDonald says, quote, "Be skeptical of all theories," end quote, and then talks about devotion to the revolution without replacing the revolution with any new theory. I don't fucking understand that sentence. Then the crisis comes and Mr. MacDonald says, quote, "Be skeptical of all theories," end quote, and then talks about devotion to the revolution without replacing it with any new theory, unless it is this skeptical theory of MacDonald's own. How can we work without a theory? What is the fight of the masses, and what is a revolutionary? The whole article is scandalous, and a party which can tolerate such a man as one of its leaders is not serious. I quote again, quote, "What is the nature of the beast fascism then?" Trotsky insists the nature of fascism is no more nor less than the familiar phenomenon of Bonapartism, in which a clique maintains that clique's self in power by playing one class off against another, thus giving the state power a temporary autonomous character. But these modern totalitarian regimes are not temporary affairs. These modern totalitarian regimes have already changed the underlying economic and social structure, not only manipulating the old forms, but also destroying the old forms' inner validity. Is the Nazi bureaucracy a new ruling class then, and fascism a new form of society, comparable to capitalism? That doesn't seem to be true either," end quote. Here, MacDonald creates a new theory, a new definition of fascism, but MacDonald wishes, nevertheless, that we should be skeptical toward all theories. So also to the workers, Dwight MacDonald would say that the instruments and tools they work with are not important, but they must have devotion to their work. I think the workers would find a very sharp expression for such a statement. It is very characteristic of the disappointed intellectual. He sees the war, the terrible epoch ahead, with losses, with sacrifices, This is very characteristic of the disappointed intellectual. The disappointed intellectual sees the war, the terrible epoch ahead, with losses, with sacrifices, and the disappointed intellectual is afraid. The disappointed intellectual begins to propagate skepticism, and still, the disappointed intellectual believes it is possible to unify skepticism with revolutionary devotion. We can only develop a revolutionary devotion if we are sure a revolutionary devotion is rational and possible, and we cannot have such assurances without a working theory. He who propagates theoretical skepticism is a traitor. We analyzed in fascism different elements. 1. The element which fascism has in common with the old Bonapartism is that it used the antagonisms of classes in order to give to the state power the greatest independence. But we have always underlined that the old Bonapartism was in a time of an ascending bourgeois society, while fascism is a state power of the declining bourgeois society. 2. That fascism is an attempt of the bourgeois class to overstep the contradiction between the new technique and private property without eliminating the private property. It is the, quote, planned economy, end quote, of fascism. It is an attempt to save private property and at the same time to check private property. 3. To overstep the contradiction between the new modern technique of productive forces within the limited border of the national state. This new technique cannot be limited by the borders of the old national state, and fascism attempts to overcome this contradiction. The result is the war. We have analyzed all these elements. We've already analyzed all these elements. Dwight MacDonald will abandon the party just as Burnham did, but possibly because Dwight MacDonald is a little lazier, it will come later. Burnham was considered, quote, good stuff, end quote, at one time. Yes, the proletarian party in our epoch must make use of every intellectual who can contribute to the party. I spent months on Diego Rivera to save him for our movement, but did not succeed. Every international has had an experience of this kind. The first international had troubles with the poet Freiligrath, who was also very capricious. The second and third internationals had trouble with Maxim Gorky. The fourth international with Rivera. In every case, they separated from us. Burnham was, of course, closer to the movement, but Cannon had his doubts about Burnham. Burnham can write and has some formal skill in thinking, not deep but adroit. Burnham can accept your idea, develop your idea, write a fine article about your idea, and then forget your idea. The author can forget, but the worker cannot. However, so long as we can use such people, well and good. Mussolini at one time was also, quote, good stuff, end quote, exclamation point. Coyoacán, D.F., August 7th, 1940. Published in the Fourth International, October 1940. And this was labeled Workers' Party, a Petty Bourgeois Tendency. That may also be what the piece was originally titled. So it wasn't an interview, it was just, I guess it just started with a question. Or maybe someone has asked it, I don't know, but it kind of seemed like he just kept going. The next piece is titled No Conciliation with Renegades. And this is from the Socialist Workers' Party, 1941. And it says it's from points 12 to 14 of a resolution adopted by a Socialist Workers' Party, quote, plenum conference. The Militant, published in the Militant, 18th of October, 1941. In the next period, our party must be more than ever absolutely unrelenting in our party's warfare against any existing or arising centrist groups, parentheses, Shachtmanites, etc., and parentheses. Lenin, never much of a unity shouter, became especially intransigent during the First World War as the fundamental cleavage between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks revealed itself more clearly. So now must we maintain the cohesion of the genuine revolutionists during this war. Trotsky said the fight between the proletarian majority of the party and the petty bourgeois opposition was similar in many respects to the historical struggle between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in the Russian movement. In justice to the Russian Mensheviks, Trotsky also said they appear as revolutionary heroes in comparison with the wretched faction of Burnham, Shachtman, and Co. We must educate cadres who are not afraid of isolation and do not seek fictitious strength through numbers at the expense of programmatic clarity. ... The condition for a fruitful intervention on our part in a revolutionary development among the Stalinist workers, or the political awakening of any other group of serious workers, is the prohibition in our own ranks of any sentiment of conciliation toward the degenerate party bourgeois clique of Shachtman and Co. Again, this is labeled No Conciliation with Renegades, and it's from points 12 to 14 of a resolution adopted by a Socialist Workers' Party, quote, plenum conference, end quote, published in the Militant 18th of October, 1941. The next piece is labeled Workers' Party After 5 Years, by Max Shachtman. It was originally titled 5 Years of the Workers' Party, published in New International, April 1945. Another passage from that text has been extracted and included at page 593. Again, it's by Max Shachtman, 1945. The Workers' Party was organized as a result of the factional struggle that broke out in the American Trotskyist movement, parenthesis, the Socialist Workers' Party and its youth organization, end parenthesis, when the Second World War began and ended in a split. Those who founded the new party had reason to be confident. First, they had better than held their own in the debate. Difference of opinion and even factional struggle were not new in the Trotskyist movement, but never before had the leadership of any section of the International shown such poverty of ideas, such bewilderment and downright helplessness when confronted by a new situation, a new problem, and a critical opposition. In face of the joint partition of Poland by Germany and Russia, followed by the invasion of Finland and the annexation of the Baltic countries by Stalin, we proposed the abandonment of the traditional position of, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR in war, end quote. We argued that Russia was playing a reactionary role in the war, having joined one of the imperialist camps in order to share in the booty, and that to support Russia meant supporting the imperialist war in violation of the interests of the international working class and socialism. The majority had no other reply save the repetition of the formula, quote, Russia is a degenerated worker state, therefore we are for Russia's unconditional defense in the war, end quote. The majority's attempts to give more specific answers to the political situation were sorry models of confusion. Witness the fact that it produced 3 mutually contradictory documents on the war in Finland in less than that number of weeks. In effect, the majority took its political courage in its hands and retired from the debate. The majority's task was taken over by Trotsky and by Trotsky alone. Never in the history of the movement did we have what followed. Trotsky found himself obliged to lead and carry on the fight for the paralyzed majority all by himself. One document by Trotsky followed another, sometimes in almost daily succession. He found it necessary to write at length on the tiniest questions or aspects of a question in dispute, and even questions that were very doubtfully related to the disagreement. One of his principal documents even sent directly to the branches of the party without the normal intermediary of the Central Party Committee. The least that can be said about him is that he more than discharged his obligations as a political leader. The American Party leadership could not have been more heavily indicted for political helplessness than it was by the very thoroughness with which Trotsky was compelled to assume the burdens that properly belonged to it. The majority confined the majority's self to acting as Trotsky's phonograph. In the days between the arrival of records, it was astutely and firmly silent. To be sure, a phonograph that does no more than reproduce an eloquent voice performs a much more valuable service than a man from whose throat emerges only unharmonious gibberish. Still, if it continues to play the record 1,000 times over, it will never develop a voice itself. It will always remain a phonograph that needs a record in order to articulate. The man with the throat has the advantage after all. He cannot only listen to the recorded voice, but can, by persistent application, develop a clear voice of his own. It's kind of funny reading this, because it's I don't fucking produce anything original myself, or produce any more than just like marginal comments on the things that I'm reading, and just kind of like, hey, this is what this person said, and I feel a little attacked here, but no, I'm not just waving quotations in other people's face, or at least just not just one person's quotations. I'd like to think there's a little bit of a democratic heterogeneity in what I put up here, within obviously boundaries, but it's funny thinking about, I don't know, transmitting other people's ideas instead of putting forward your own and how it relates to myself. Trotsky enjoyed a tremendous authoritative, not authoritarian, standing among the members of the minority. Only the greater strength of the minority's arguments enabled the minority to continue the debate with Trotsky. When the debate ended, the minority had held not only to the minority's views, but to the minority's forces. In the final vote, the minority had more than 40% of the votes. If the Trotskyist movement is taken as a whole in this country, party and youth organizations together, the minority had well over 50% of the votes. It is a distinct victory for us. As for the Canaanites, it was an utterly crushing defeat from every standpoint. I mean, I think that is definitely the case. Like, if the minority wins 40% of the party membership to its side when the split occurs, and that was going against whose like main debate partner was Leon Trotsky himself, the kind of founder and hero of the movement, whose like prestige, at least among the non-Stalinist left, anyone who had any kind of sympathy for the Bolshevik Revolution, was like profound. The prestige and the esteem that Trotsky's ideas had, and continue to have for a lot of people. The fact that they were able to like put forward such persuasive arguments against some of his positions on the Russian question is a huge defeat. Like, the fact that they were able to mount any kind of like serious like block or minority or like faction against Trotsky on this like very, very important issue is tremendous. Of course, people say, oh yeah, well that's because the minority was capitulating to mainstream bourgeois opinion in the United States or whatever. But I think that mainstream bourgeois opinion in the United States about the Soviet Union would not have been an important intellectual pressure on the minority faction. Also, you could say that like the critique of Stalinism in general was a form, like, people could say that, right? Like, I mean, I don't think it's legitimate, but people could say that or try to argue that like the critique of Stalinism from a radical revolutionary left perspective was a capitulation to Western bourgeois opinion, because Russia, the bourgeoisie hates Stalin. So if you also hate Stalin from a very different kind of angle, you're actually just succumbing to petty bourgeois pressures. Sorry, I got to get back to the text. When the debate ended, the minority held not only to the minority's views, but to the minority's forces. In the final vote, the minority had more than 40% of the votes. If the Trotskyist movement is taken as a whole in this country, party and youth organizations together, the minority had well over 50% of the votes. It was a distinct victory for us. As for the Canaanites, it was an utterly crushing defeat from every standpoint. There is no doubt that if Trotsky had not intervened, parenthesis, Trotsky had, of course, both the right and duty to intervene, end parenthesis, the Canaanites would simply have been inundated in the fight. In the second place, the way in which the split took place enhanced our confidence. The split, to our knowledge, simply has no precedent in the working class movement. To this day, the Canaanites have carefully guarded against making public even their membership to the full extent of the resolution, even to their membership, the full extent of the resolution that split the Socialist Workers' Party. The first part of the resolution provided for acceptance of the decisions of the convention that had just taken place, parenthesis, April 1940, end parenthesis, and a commitment to, quote, carry them out in a disciplined manner, end quote. This, quote, clever, end quote, motion, characteristic of the little mind that conceived it, merely meant that the minority should vote to gag the minority self in the working class public on the most vital questions of the day: the war, the approve of handing over its inter-party rights to the mercies of a majority that had gone out of that majority's way to prove that that majority was entitled to no such confidence. What the hell does it say? I think I might have fucked that up. This, quote, clever motion, characteristic of the little mind that conceived this motion, merely meant that the minority should vote to gag the minority self in the working class public on the most vital questions of the day, the war, and approve handing over the minority's inter-party rights to the mercies of a majority that had gone out of its way to prove that it was entitled to no such confidence. We, therefore, abstained in the vote on this motion. The second part of the resolution provided that those not voting for the part shall, for that reason alone, be deprived of all party positions, responsibilities, and rights. In their introduction to Trotsky's In Defense of Marxism, Joseph Hansen and Ward described the occurrence. They quote the first part of the resolution and add, quote, the minority bloc leaders refused to vote for this motion instead of expelling them as would have been wholly justified, bracket, parenthesis, end bracket. The majority still waited. End quote. 2 points. 1. The decisive second part of the motion is not quoted. Why? Are our bold men so ashamed of their innovation? 2. The majority did not, quote, still wait, end quote, for the simple reason that, as stated above, the second part of the motion provided for our expulsion in every respect except pure form, namely the removal from all posts and for disfranchisement in the party and deprivation of all rights of party membership. That is how the disciples of the, quote, historian of American Trotskyism, end quote, writes its history. A unique contribution to revolutionary party procedure, exclamation point. We had not violated a single disciplinary provision. We were not even charged with any such violation. We were expelled in effect merely for abstaining from the vote on the majority's motion, providing that we, quote, accept, end quote, convention decisions, which among other things branded us as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote. The whole procedure lasted, as the party boss gleefully noted to a crony at the meeting, exactly 4 3/4 minutes. We know well in advance what and whom we were dealing with. We knew, insofar as it is possible to be certain in politics, the leading clique was determined to get rid of the opposition, especially because it was not prepared to proclaim the omniscience and omnipotence of ignorance and impotence. So the minority was well prepared. The Workers' Party was publicly proclaimed, and our labor action and New International were issued shortly after the expulsion ukaz, which is decree. Fear of our views and of our ability and determination to defend our views prompted our expulsion, and nothing else. The consciousness of this only fortified us in our actions. Thirdly, we had won to our side the overwhelming majority of the youth. In itself, this may not be, quote, proof, end quote, of anything, but in such situations, it is almost invariably an excellent sign. The history of the revolutionary movement shows exceedingly few, if any, exceptions to the rule that in such disputes the youth takes the side of the left wing against the right or conservative wing. How reconcile this fact with the accusation that we were a, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote? The majority simply never made a serious attempt to reconcile the two, except perhaps by repeating some of the, quote, explanations, end quote, made by the Socialist Party right-wingers when the Socialist Youth joined with the Trotskyists in 1938, or else by repeating the accusation in a louder voice. And lastly, the development of the war confirmed our position on Russia's role in the war, and not that of the majority, which found the majority self-compelled with each new event and turned to explain away the arguments the majority had given for its position the day before. The political question around which the dispute revolved was the question of Russia, far from a, quote, foreign question, end quote, for the whole world and the whole labor movement finds itself forced more and more each day to discuss and decide it, the question of Russia. In politics, nobody has the right to rest on an adopted position without constantly submitting and resubmitting that position to the test of events, to the test of honest self-criticism and the criticism of opponents. Only lead-bottomed and brass-headed smugness can speak in the revolutionary movement of, quote, our finished program, end quote. Finished, exsanguinated, and embalmed, waxed and polished, shrouded and crated and consecrated, entombed in its headstone. This phrase is now the favorite shibboleth of the Socialist Workers' Party. If Marx and Engels had so much as thought in such terms, even after writing the program of the Communists, which we know as the Communist Manifesto, we would not have the Marxian theory of the state today. To say nothing of other few trifles in our arsenal, like the theory of the permanent revolution. How the positions taken in 1939 to 1940 stood up under the test of the years that followed. In a word, we have strengthened ours. They have had to abandon theirs, and they will have to abandon more before long. Our position to the defense of Stalinist Russia in the war was explained by the Canaanites as due to, quote, bourgeois democratic pressure, end quote. How? It appears that we had left Russia to fight single-handed against Poland and Finland. The bourgeoisie of the democratic countries had launched a big campaign against Russia for the alliance with fascist imperialism. And to this campaign, we succumbed. However, nowhere in any of our writings of the time or since did we motivate our position on the grounds that Russia had made an alliance with wicked fascist imperialism instead of with benevolent democratic imperialism. The Canaanites, completely off the track, worked themselves into the belief that this was our motivation and nothing else. Predictions were fairly made that if and when Russia switched to the camp of Anglo-American imperialism and the, quote, bourgeois democratic pressure, end quote, would be exerted in the other direction, we would make a turn in our course. Naturally, nothing of the sort occurred. More exactly, it did occur in the case of about a dozen party members who had taken our position in 1939, but had proposed to reverse it in favor of support of Russia in the war once Hitler attacked in the East and Russia joined the camp of the democratic imperialists. It is interesting to note that it was this group of comrades who failed to win any support for their position in our party, that thereupon returned to the Socialist Workers' Party, where it was welcomed with enthusiastic cheers. The accusation against us on the score of, quote, bourgeois democratic pressure, end quote, obviously made no sense. It makes even less sense and stands out as the factional invention that it was from the outset when the record of the Workers' Party on the imperialist war in general is examined. If, as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, the Workers' Party had succumbed to the pressure of bourgeois democracy even before this country was in war, and the connection, after all, with mother country, it stands to reason that the Workers' Party would certainly succumb to this pressure when it was exerted in the direct interest of American imperialism, namely when the United States itself entered the war. And as Trotsky once remarked, there must be some reason even in slander. Yet to put it with restraint, there was not and is not the slightest evidence of our, quote, succumbing, end quote. On the contrary, the Workers' Party was the only working class organization, with no exception, which took a forthright, unambiguous position in public in opposition to American imperialism in the war. Our manifesto and labor action on this score was the only thing to appear in the labor movement immediately after the Pearl Harbor events. In this we did our elementary duty. It was our political demonstration against American imperialism, and under the circumstances, the best that could have been, parentheses, certainly the least that should have been, end parentheses, made. The Socialist Workers' Party did not follow suit. This fact cannot be talked away, although efforts have not been lacking, and since Pearl Harbor as before it, our position has been equally forthright and unambiguous. It has formed part of our work of awakening the consciousness of the American working class, of arousing it to its class interest, of imbuing it with the spirit of socialist internationalism. We did not change our position on Russia, but as stated, we did strengthen it. Unlike the Canaanites, we sought to learn from the 1939-40 discussion. If Trotsky was the only one we could learn from, that was neither his fault nor ours. Trotsky was the only one who contributed to his side of the debate. Trotsky never succeeded in freeing himself from the basic contradictions of his position. Trotsky could not, nor did Trotsky attempt to, explain how the counter-revolutionary, anti-socialist, anti-Soviet, Bonapartist bureaucracy, as Trotsky rightly called it, could nevertheless establish in capitalist countries such as Poland and the Baltic Islands, and the Baltic lands, the Baltic lands, I was like, Baltic Islands, okay. Poland and the Baltic lands, what Trotsky called the foundations of a worker state, i.e. carry out a social revolution, quote, via bureaucratic military means, end quote. Trotsky could not explain why, if Stalinist Russia is like a big trade union in power whose army is to be supported, he is nevertheless opposed to this, quote, union, end quote, gaining in membership and strength, so to speak, by extending its frontiers. Parenthesis, quote, we were and remain against seizures of new territories by the Kremlin, end quote, Trotsky wrote. But Trotsky did not succeed in pointing out many of the contradictions in our position as it was developed. But Trotsky did succeed in pointing out many of the contradictions in our position as our position was developed and defended at that time. At least that is the opinion of the present writer, who again is Max Shachtman. The untenability of Trotsky's basic position and the defects and contradictions Trotsky revealed in our original position only stimulated us to deeper and further analysis of the question. The result, a product of genuinely collective thought and elaboration by the leading comrades of our party, was worked out and presented, not, thank God, as a, quote, finished program, end quote, in our theory of Stalinist Russia as a bureaucratic collectivist state. Our theory has been put forward in great detail elsewhere. Here, it is necessary to point out only two things. One is that our theory not only made possible a more harmonious relationship to our practical policy than before, but enabled us to eliminate the weaknesses contained not so much in the policy, parenthesis, i.e. refusal to defend Russia in the war, end parenthesis, as in some of the motivations for it. Two is that the Canaanites, once so insistent on discussing the, quote, class character of the Soviet Union, end quote, have surely avoided dealing with this question from the moment that we presented our own systematic position on it. The question itself is so monstrous, however, that it will not tolerate silence. One way or another, the silence had to be broken, and it has been. Stalin's spectacular successes in the defense of the, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, have now imposed a, quote, turn, end quote, in policy upon the Socialist Workers' Party. One second. It is one of the most remarkable, quote, turns in the history of the movement. The slogan of, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of Russia in the war was what distinguished the Socialist Workers' Party from the rest of the world. So it said repeatedly during the war and in just those words. Whoever did not work for the victory of the Russian army in the war thereby placed himself on the other side of the barricades. That too was said in those words, and more than once. It would seem now that this slogan has been favored by truly rich success. The Russian armies are victorious on every front. Now, if ever, is the time for the bearers of the slogan to cheer their victory, and to express a justified pride in themselves and in the modest contribution they made to the victory. It is almost the very opposite that has happened. Near the very pinnacle of overwhelming victory, it has been discovered that the slogan which aimed to bring about this victory must now be abandoned. Exclamation point. Slogans have abandoned and policies changed before now, and so it will be in the future. This is the first case we know of, however, where a slogan has been abandoned because that slogan proved to be too successful. An indispensable addition to this is the fact that it has been abandoned with an accompanying insistence that the only reason ever given for advancing it in the first place still holds, namely that Russia is a worker state. To be sure, quote, abandoned, end quote, is a strong, simple, forthright word, and above all in the present case a most embarrassing word, a substitute of the requisite delicacy, equivocalness, and face-saving quality had to be found, and it was. The slogan is not really, quote, abandoned, end quote. No, the slogan merely, quote, recedes to the background, end quote, like a coffin, quote, receding, end quote, to the grave. It is merely what we, quote, are shifting our emphasis, merely that we are, quote, are shifting our emphasis, end quote, to another slogan. Priceless formulas. Classics of their type. Their author should somehow be rescued from modest anonymity. He may not be worth a damn as a revolutionary leader, but what a diplomat he would make in Monaco. What slogans do the Canaanites, quote, push to the fore, end quote? To which one do the Canaanites shift the emphasis? To the, quote, defense of the European Revolution, against the Kremlin bureaucracy, against all the Kremlin bureaucracy's agents and agencies, end quote, presumably including the, quote, Red Army, end quote, which has suddenly become, quote, an instrument of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, end quote. Good, very good. But just why is it necessary to push and to shift right now? Because, because the slogan of the past 5 years was too good. The slogan suffered from an overabundance of success. How did it come about that the European Revolution is so perilously threatened by the Russian army? Because, because the Russian army has been so victorious. As a result, in microscopic part, to be sure, end parenthesis, of the slogan that was just, quote, receded, end quote. We read in the Socialist Workers' Party press today that, quote, the attitude of the revolutionary vanguard toward the Red Army occupations in Eastern Europe is thus essentially no different than its attitude toward Anglo-American troops in Western Europe, end quote. That's a big sentence. We read in the Socialist press today, Workers' Party press today, that, quote, the attitude of the revolutionary vanguard toward the Red Army occupation troops in Eastern Europe is thus essentially no different than its attitude toward Anglo-American troops in Western Europe, end quote. But the very reason why it is necessary today to adopt this, quote, attitude, end quote, is that for 5 years the Socialist Workers' Party has urged everyone to be the, quote, best soldier in the Red Army, end quote, in order that it might be victorious, i.e. so that it might become the, quote, occupation troops in Eastern Europe, end quote. There you have the balance sheet after 5 years. The old line must, quote, recede, end quote, because the old line was such a success. Honest and open abandonment of the fatal policy, with honest and open self-criticism, is the very precondition of educating the party and the workers around the party. The Socialist Workers' Party leadership is not concerned with education. The Socialist Workers' Party leadership is concerned only with face-saving and bureaucratic prestige. Honest self-criticism would show that virtually every point on which Trotsky assailed the Chinese policy of Stalin in 1925-27 applies to the Canaanite policy on Russia in the war. Like Stalin in China, they embellished their, quote, ally, end quote. They confused the banners, they urged capitulation to Stalin by those who were rising independently. Proof, here it is. The fundamental sophism. They disseminated glibly what Trotsky called the fundamental sophism of Stalinism, namely that the Russian workers own the factories and the land. This sophism is contained not only in numerous articles in the Socialist Workers' Party press, but in a unanimously adopted convention resolution. It has yet to be repudiated. They disseminated glibly the declaration that the army they now call counter-revolutionary was, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote. They proclaimed that this army of counter-revolution, which is now to be treated like the other imperialist armies, is bringing socialism to Europe. Parenthesis, now the revolution in Europe must be defended from the army that was ... bringing socialism to Europe. A real, quote, shift in emphasis, end quote, if we ever saw one, exclamation point, end parenthesis. They advised the rebellious peasants of Iran not to impede the progress or damage the interests of the, quote, red, end quote, army. Parenthesis, by the way, they still call the, quote, instrument of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, end quote, a red army. The shift has not been made in full, it seems, end parenthesis. And only yesterday, their leader, who still thought the background was the foreground, advised the Warsaw revolutionists to put themselves voluntarily at the disposal of the Stalinist hangmen. This is no shift in emphasis. It is a rout. It is the collapse of a policy. The Socialist Workers' Party are not trying to save the fragments, but only their faces. Here, too, the comparison with Stalin in 1927 is striking. Old, previously obscured and never used quotations are dug up to show that they really, quote, foresaw everything, end quote, and were not, quote, caught unawares. The Socialist Workers' Party even have the coolness to say that the Socialist Workers' Party made the, quote, shift, end quote, a long time ago, when every child in the party now has the documents that prove how the Socialist Workers' Party resisted a change in line and adopted it at the very last minute under the pressure of the, quote, outside, end quote, comrade who has been called an eminent interventionist. The new tactic, says the loudest of the party's empty barrels, was made, quote, some 9 months ago, bracket, by, end bracket, our committee, end quote. End quote, the discerning reader will have noticed that we conducted our propaganda in this spirit for a good many months, end quote. But since hellishly few readers are discerning, and since those that are would have needed a microscope, and since, after all, a turn in policy ought to be made for the information and guidance of every reader including those with less, quote, discernment, end quote, and since the empty barrel has discerned that it requires little discernment to see through his dodges, he adds, quote, we propose now to incorporate this tactical prescription in our resolution in order to make unambiguously clear to all the nature of our tactical adjustment and the reasons for it, end quote. Fourth International, February 1945, bracket, the article was by Bert Cochran, end bracket. Push, shift, adjustment, no, a first-class rout. The rout is not yet complete. What we are also witnessing in the Socialist Workers' Party after 5 years is the collapse of the Socialist Workers' Party's basic theory on Russia. Unable to speak any longer with enthusiasm or conviction for the theory that Russia is still a worker state, and dogmatically refusing to examine objectively the theory we have put forward, they have nothing left to do but hunt feverishly for signs that Stalin is restoring capitalism in the form of private property. In the hunt, right, and with the inevitable aid of Pravda, has already turned up the usual kulak with the usual extra cow in the usual mountain village. Of more significant signs in Russia, there are none. The huntsmen have a long search in store for them. Outside of Russia, in the occupied countries, they have noticed that Stalin has yet not nationalized property everywhere. The Socialist Workers' Party have not reflected that for the time being, the Russian bureaucracy can very well exploit these countries as semi-colonies without in the least changing the social and economic structure of its own regime. It will not be the Romanian economy that will determine the Russian, but the other way around. The hunt for, quote, capitalism in Russia is, so far as the Canaanites are concerned, a desperate search for a way of abandoning the Canaanites' untenable theory without losing the Canaanites' dearest possession, face. He who lives will see. The Workers' Party never had the need for such gyrations. From the beginning of the war, the Workers' Party repeated that the victory of the armies of the Stalinist counter-revolution did not coincide with the interests of the working class. Whatever errors we may have made in detail, our basic policy was clear and correct, and is now fully confirmed. We warned the workers that Russia was playing a reactionary and imperialist role in the war, that Russia was participating in the imperialist division of the spoils, now on the side of Germany, now on the side of England, America. We urged that the workers and colonial peoples declare their independence of both imperialist camps and form their own movement and organization. And that organization of this, quote, third camp, end quote, was the first step toward real peace and freedom. Now, the Canaanites who derided the idea of the, quote, third camp, end quote, are now compelled to advance the idea of the third camp themselves, but of course without using the same term. Now the Canaanites no longer repeat that Russia is part of the camp of the proletariat and the colonial peoples. The Canaanites laughed themselves wet at the idea that Russia was following an imperialist policy for Russia's share of the spoils. Russia was merely defending Russia's self, you see, by bureaucratic methods. Now, in the Socialist Workers' Party's shamed-faced, quote, shift, end quote, they make their revolutionary retractions. We now read that Russian, quote, foreign policy has lost every vestige of its former isolationism and defensism and is becoming aggressively expansionist and adventurist, end quote. Imperialist? Good Lord, no. That term is petty bourgeois heresy. Russia is merely, quote, aggressively expansionist and adventurist, end quote. Apparently a whim on Stalin's part. We read further that the Allies, quote, accept Stalin as a third partner and in a business-like manner arrange with Stalin a division of spoils, end quote. Parenthesis, Fourth International, March 1945, end parenthesis. Imperialist? My God, no. It is simply a case of the poor little worker state in sheer self-defense getting a share of the ... spoils. It is to be regretted that there are people who begrudge it even so modest an award for its efforts to bring socialism to Europe on the bayonets of Trotsky's Red Army. 5 years have sufficed for the test on the, quote, Russian question, end quote. There is incontrovertible evidence to show who survived the test. The dispute on the Russian question was important, and so it will continue to be. But far more important is the question of participation in the class struggle in the United States. In this field, the work of our party has been valuable and fruitful. We founded the Workers' Party with a membership composed, for the most part, of youth. The preceding years of crisis and depression had deprived many of the youth of the opportunity of entering industry and taking part in the trade union movement. The war gave those who were not drafted the opportunity they sought. Before long, virtually our entire membership was concentrated in important industries and active in the labor movement, acquiring experience not only from the older party members, but also from the militants in the labor movement with whom they established friendly contact. The difficulties encountered in carrying on militant activities in the trade unions during the war need little elaboration. There is the powerful pressure exerted on all sides for, quote, national unity, end quote, so that the ruling class may increase the ruling class's power in carrying out the ruling class's reactionary policies without interference by the workers acting in defense of their class interests. There are the conservative trade union leaders tied to the imperialist machine and exerting every ounce of their strength against effective independent action by the workers and against the militants who urge it. There are, above all, the Stalinists ready and eager to pounce upon every progressive and every genuine socialist, to frame him up, to bound him and drive him out of the labor movement. And there is always the unholy combination of the employers, trade union, bureaucrats, and draft boards, which does not hesitate to use its power to ferret out militants and get rid of them. All in all, not the easiest conditions for the activities of militants. Yet apart from considerations of socialist duty to the working class, there were also favorable conditions. The measure of our activity in the labor movement was not determined, as some would like to put it, by arbitrary considerations. Before the war, we had all declared in our analysis that once the war had got underway, the political differences between the totalitarian and the democratic countries would dwindle rapidly. We also foresaw a working class swept by a mighty chauvinistic wave with the beginning of the war in this country. Neither prediction proved correct. In the United States, the working class soon showed that while it supported the war, above all in the sense of not wanting to see the country defeated by Germany or Japan, its support was reluctant, mingled with healthy suspicion of imperialism and the class intentions of the capitalists. Without the opportunity to express itself in organized form, it nevertheless showed growing hostility to all attempts to lower its living standards or deprive it of political rights. The labor movement was bent to its knees by the union leaders, but the labor movement could not The labor movement was bent to its knees by the union leaders, but they could not prostrate it. They could not even prevent it from rising repeatedly to its feet and fighting for its interests. The existence of a powerful labor movement, plus its barely suppressed mood of militancy, undoubtedly slowed down enormously the tendency toward totalitarianism in the United States during the war. Refusing to be guided by disproved assertions of yesterday, we established these facts early in the war and proceeded to orient our activities accordingly. In this respect, too, our analysis was justified by the results. We set ourselves the goal of bringing the militant moods of the workers to the surface, of stimulating the militant moods of the workers to more conscious action in defense of the workers' class interests, of awakening the workers to independent political action. We did not retire to a storm cellar for the duration, quote, until it blows over, end quote. And if we did not, it was not out of intemperate brashness or heroism. We rightly judged both the needs and the possibilities. Our party, during the war, constituted the principal and clearest center of the militant movement in the trade unions. It is absurd to think that the progressive forces revolved around our small party, and it is far from our mind to say any such thing. Literally thousands, even tens of thousands of workers in the unions did not allow the outbreak of the war to stop the struggle for a progressive labor movement. Many times they would put forward ideas and launch campaigns on their own initiative, which our party thereupon decided to champion. This is true not only of many of the nameless rank and file, but of better-known rank and file union leaders too. If our party was distinguished from them, it was not necessarily in degree of aggressiveness, but primarily in the fact that we sought to harmonize the fight for all the progressive measures, to explain their fundamental significance in the class struggle, to show their connection with the imperialist war, and to relate them to the need for independent political action and socialism. It could be summed up saying that our party sought to imbue the American workers with class consciousness. We were among the front-rank fighters, as we still are against the paralyzing, quote, no-strike pledge, end quote, urging the labor movement to reclaim its power to resist the encroachments of war-swollen capitalism. Towards the same end, we called upon labor to withdraw its representatives from the War Labor Board, which we characterize as the cemetery of labor's grievances. Our party carried on a persistent propaganda in favor of labor breaking from the capitalist parties and forming a labor party of its own. One second. Sorry, got distracted. Our party carried on a persistent propaganda in favor of labor breaking from the capitalist parties and forming a labor party of its own, based on the representative mass organizations of the workers. Unquestionably, thousands of progressives developed these ideas on their own. Our contribution was to provide the best reasons for these demands, an unceasing agitation for these demands, an organized center from which the movement for these demands could be systematically maintained, stimulated, and clarified. We sought furthermore to connect up these demands with a far broader, more significant program of action to be adopted as the fighting platform for the American working class. The central aim of this program still is the mobilization of the American working class as a unified conscious political force, the struggle against the capitalist class and the capitalist class's government, the defense of labor's interests at every step of the road and at the expense of capitalist profit and capitalist power, and the establishment of a party of labor and a workers' government. In this campaign, we had from the outset an invaluable instrument, labor action. Our party is exceptionally proud of labor action,
To publish Labor Action, we had to break with a long tradition, but the break did not prove to be difficult, and the results more than justified the break. We decided to issue, for the first time in the history of the revolutionary movement in this country, a popular socialist agitational weekly addressing itself primarily to the progressive trade unionist. Labor Action was to be written in simple language with an absolute minimum of the special jargon familiar in the radical movement, and only in it. It was not to be written on the assumption that its readers already agree with every political and theoretical idea of the editors, but rather on the assumption that the readers agree only with a very few of the more elementary ideas of the editors. It was to appeal to the readers on the basis of his daily experiences, of his immediate problems, of those views which the editors, the party, and most, if not all, the readers already had in common. And by having this as its point of departure, as its main emphasis, could the paper then bring the attention of the readers to the fundamental principles of socialism, to the more advanced political conceptions for which this paper stood, and develop his understanding and sympathy. Above all, it was to be an active participant and guide of the militant workers in the labor movement. If Labor Action has not always succeeded in achieving every detail of Labor Action's original purpose, Labor Action has nevertheless come to so much closer to it that no other If Labor Action has not always succeeded in achieving every detail of Labor Action's original purpose, Labor Action has nevertheless come so much closer to it that no other radical paper even merits serious comparison with Labor Action. The type of paper Labor Action aimed to be dictated a mass distribution among workers. The popularity and influence of the paper among tens of thousands of workers exceeded our most ambitious hopes. Indirectly, through the agitation and activity of Labor Action's readers, Labor Action's ideas reach additional tens of thousands. It is no exaggeration to say that in some of the largest working class concentrations of this country, the weekly arrival of Labor Action is eagerly awaited. Lunchtime in many plants finds thousands of workers with their copies of Labor Action open before them. Factory walls are decorated with articles, editorials, and cartoons clipped from Labor Action's pages. Time after time, and in city after city, unaffiliated militants have collected subscriptions to Labor Action from fellow workers and done it completely on their own initiative. The influence exerted by the ideas of the Workers' Party has not been limited for its source to the written word. In plant and in union, members of our party have not been missing from the fight for progressive and militant policies. Our labor has not called upon the workers in general to do what our members have refrained from doing. From the beginning, the activities of our party members has been directed toward the formation of broad progressive groups of all the militants in the trade unions who agree on a minimum program of action to restore the fighting capacity of the labor movement. Where such groups already exist, we have worked to unite such groups on a national scale in order to increase their effectiveness. Our activities have yielded fruit. The rabid, concentrated fury of the Stalinists in particular against what they call Trotskyism in the labor movement is a notable tribute to these activities. It goes without saying that we do not deserve 1/10 of the compliments paid us by the Stalinists. The activities the Stalinists denounce as Trotskyists are due only in small part to the work of our party, but the significance of their denunciations cannot be overrated. There is a good deal of truth even in their frenzied falsehoods and calumnies. Under Trotskyism, they include every policy, every act calculated to strengthen the working class, to retrieve the working class's independence and freedom of movement, to advance the working class's economic and political interest. If by this they mean to convey the idea that Trotskyism is the most consistent, most clear-headed, and most aggressive advocate of such policies, they are involuntarily telling the truth. The falsehoods consist in their declarations that everyone who takes a progressive position on any question confronting the labor movement, be it John L. Lewis or Norman Thomas, Thomas de Lorenzo or Jesse Ferrazza, Samuel Wolchok or David Dubinsky, is thereby a Trotskyist or in a, quote, conspiracy, end quote, with the Trotskyists. The falsehoods become calumny when the falsehoods associate every progressive or militant revolutionist with fascists like Coughlin, or with their own blood ally of yesterday, Hitler. We readily accept another involuntary tribute the Stalinists pay us. Wherever they attack the work not of those the Stalinists tried to label as Trotskyist, but of real Trotskyist, in 4 cases out of 5, is the activities of the Workers' Party they have in mind. We of the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, unquote, are proud of the fact that we are a thorn in the side of the totalitarian gangsters in the labor movement. We are proud of the fact that in the past year, for example, the brunt of the fight for progressive and class struggle policies in some of the most important unions of the CIO, insofar as it was borne by organized and conscious revolutionists, was borne by militants of the Workers' Party and their close friends and by no other party. We do not hesitate to say that it was our comrades and other trade union militants working with them who led or helped to lead the fight for a regenerated labor movement in the conventions of the shipbuilding workers, the rubber workers, the auto workers, the electrical workers, the steel workers, and in such movements as the Michigan Commonwealth Federation. The Socialist Party played no part in these movements, lined up with the conservatives, or else the Socialist Party's members acted in an individual manner as each saw fit. The Canaanites were conspicuous by the Canaanites' absence, or by the Canaanites' silence, or in some cases by the Canaanites' factional sabotage of progressive movements which the Canaanites could not dominate. The policy of the Canaanites in the trade unions during these 5 years is worth an added comment, if only to contrast the policy of the Canaanites with the policy the Workers' Party pursued. The Canaanites did not follow a policy cautiously. Caution was their policy. And by, quote, caution, end quote, the Workers' Party meant abstention from any notable activity in the unions. The policy the Socialist Workers' Party leadership imposed upon the members was argued as follows. This is wartime. The workers are not in motion. We must lie quiet until the workers do get into motion. Then we will offer the workers our leadership. Meanwhile, we must confine ourselves to, quote, preserving the cadres, end quote. A more specious opportunism is hard to find. That opportunism became disgusting when it was coupled with sneers at the, quote, adventurism, end quote, of those who did their revolutionary duty. The policy was not swallowed by all the Socialist Workers' Party members. In Detroit at first, elsewhere later, protests were made against it, but in vain. One of the protests of recent date correctly attacked the policy as follows. Quote, we cannot lay low and abstain from any substantial leadership now while awaiting the upsurge itself and expect the workers to follow us once it comes, ... When the workers do begin to move on a mass scale, why should they follow anyone who did not previously supply Why should they follow anyone who did not previously supply some type of leadership? How would they know that we are even capable of this leadership? How would a young comrade even gain his leadership experience and confidence while sitting it out? End quote. It is interesting to note in passing that Trotsky warned us all against such an interpretation of the formula, quote, preserve the cadres, end quote. The question was raised by the Socialist Workers' Party boss in our discussion with Trotsky early in 1938 about the party in the coming war. Trotsky answered in effect, naturally, if we do nothing but preserve the cadres, end quote, during the war, the workers will treat us like preserves and put us on the shelf. The last phrase of his, I remember word for word, quote, they will treat us like preserves and put us on the shelf, end quote. The warning was not heeded by Cannon, a contrary course was imposed, and the Socialist Workers' Party kept itself on the shelf. For our part, we operated in the trade union movement on the basis not only of what was possible, but what was necessary. We understood that the class consciousness and cohesion of the revolutionists cannot be, quote, preserved, end quote, without continuous activity to awaken the class consciousness and strengthen the cohesion of the working class as a whole. To break this link can only have pernicious consequences. Where the hell am I? I pressed the button. God damn it. What the hell? There we are. It is impossible to deal here with every aspect of the work and life of our party in these 5 years, but a balance sheet of losses and gains should be cast up. Our losses have been of different kinds, not easy to bear. Our first loss was Burnham. Burnham betrayed everything he had stood for, including the movement that nurtured him intellectually. Ever since Burnham turned coat, Burnham has cut a sorry figure. People wonder how can such transparent drivel flow from such an intelligent mind, ... The explanation is easier than is generally assumed. Burnham feels driven to attribute Burnham's own betrayal to the betrayal of others. It was Trotsky that betrayed Burnham. Marxism betrayed Burnham. Socialism betrayed Burnham. The proletariat betrayed Burnham. It is all false, but it is comprehensible. Incomprehensible is the fact that Burnham continues to speak authoritatively, parenthesis, and in the very pools into which Burnham used to spit so eloquently, exclamation point, end parenthesis, on politics. Surely a man who insists that he was so easily, so systematically, and so thoroughly fooled on the most important political questions of our time disqualifies himself as a political thinker by that very admission. If a lady kept moaning that for 10 years running she was unable to walk along a lighted street without surrendering enthusiastically to every gay blade she met, she might be entitled to sympathy or to a guardian or to seclusion in a convent. She might pose as a martyr and do penance far from the sight of men. But if instead she remained at large, posed as an authority on how to resist temptation, and blamed her eager fall on the blandishments of the blades, even though there were always enough wiser ones at hand to warn her against them, people might very well say, "Lament and repent in silence, teach aesthetics if you wish, but in heaven's name do not speak about virtue." That's a funny-ass fucking analogy. Burnham's defection lost the party a talented intellect. We have not the slightest interest in denying this. The Canaanites, for unworthy factional reasons, tried to present Burnham as the political leader of the opposition itself as, quote, Burnhamite, end quote. There was no truth in this, as our comrades knew, and as was soon proved clearly. What is true is that the leading comrades made every reasonable effort to keep Burnham in the movement, where Burnham's talents would have a fertile field and not be sterilized as they are now. The efforts entirely justified in themselves proved vain. To say that Burnham's defection is part of a much more general political or social phenomenon is correct, but saying that Burnham's defection is but it does not suffice to explain every individual case. Most of the radical intellectuals collapsed, but some, like James T. Farrell and Dwight MacDonald, did remain loyal to their basic principles. It was Burnham's character that was inadequate to the task. Burnham could not bring himself to make a thorough break with a bourgeois existence. Everything else was rationalization and still is. Other losses were inevitable, and we reckoned with them from the outset. If there are, quote, laws of split, end quote, they include this one. Not all those who vote with you in a dispute go along with you in the final division. Some stay behind. Others use the turmoil of the split to drop away in the hope that they will not be noticed. We had that experience when the Trotskyists were expelled from the Stalinist Party, and during the split in the Socialist Party, and again in the split of 1940. Nothing can be done about it except write them off in advance. Another law is this one. Whenever a political fight is connected with a fight against bureaucratism, the opposition inevitably attracts to its side people who have the most peculiar notions about organizational questions and who have little in common with the opposition politically. In the showdown, they often proved to have been, quote, against bureaucratism, end quote, only to the extent that they were against democratically organized discipline and responsibility in the movement. Or else they think that the, quote, anti-bureaucrats, end quote, are fighting for the policies that the bureaucracy maliciously attributes to them. When they learn differently, they too drop away, often very bitter over the fact that they listened not to what the opposition really stood for, but to what the bureaucracy said the opposition stood for. For example, Trotsky's fight against Stalinism actually attracted some dilettantes and anti-Bolsheviks who thought Stalin was right in charging that Trotsky wanted a party of dilettantes and anti-Bolsheviks. The mistakenly attracted were soon disillusioned. Thereafter, they denounced not Stalin but Trotsky. In the Socialist Workers' Party split, we had our modest quota of such people for a while. Their defection, as well as Burnham's, was not 1/100th as serious as our real loss. Our party was composed overwhelmingly of people of draft age. It is doubtful if there is another political organization in the country which had such a high percentage of its members taken into the armed forces as our party. Being a militant working-class organization and not a group of pacifists, our people claimed no exemptions on grounds of conscience. They did not simply talk about taking on the responsibilities and tasks of their generation. They took them on, even if it meant severing relations with party activity. Among those who went off were some of the ablest and most experienced men, our indispensables, and we know that not all of them will be returned to us. Our core of organizers, speakers, and writers was cut into heavily, and that from top to bottom. It was an oppressive blow, and we suffered from it yet. What the fuck, man? Why are there so many flies out here? I don't know, my backyard fucking stinks today. It smells like garbage, but I think it's the fucking neighbors or some shit. Or maybe something died and I don't see it. But it stinks back here. There's flies. It's disgusting. Their departure laid a heavier burden on those who remained. What has been done by those who remained, especially by our magnificent female comrades, is perhaps the most inspiring and encouraging thing in our movement. Comrades have taken on doubled and trebled responsibilities and labors. Distributions of literature before and after a working day that often lasts 10 hours, meetings of branches and committees piled onto meetings of their unions and union committees, organization of classes for their own education and classes for sympathizing workers, hours spent every week in personal agitation and propaganda among fellow workers, systematic and generous financial contributions to the party's work on a scale higher than that of any other movement. These are the marks of conviction, zeal and devotion that are seldom found elsewhere. They are a guarantee of our future and the future of socialism. These are also gains to record. We have won to our party some of the best militants in the labor movement. They have learned from studying our program and observing how our deeds conform to our words that the best trade union activity in the world is incomplete and in the long run ineffectual unless it is coupled with political organization rendered coherent and consistent by a fundamental political program and political direction. The popularity of our program is an assurance that we will succeed in recruiting more of these militants in the future. The party has gained tremendously in the clarity of the party's program. What has been contributed to our political strength by the development of our position on Russia has already been dealt with. On the basis of this position, we have been able to deal more thoroughly with the problem of Stalinism as the greatest menace to the integrity and future of the labor movement. The importance of this question cannot be stressed too heavily. Among revolutionary socialists, it was long argued that the Stalinist and the conservative or reformist labor officialdom are equally dangerous to the working class. This point of view is no longer valid. To try to maintain it in practice can only lead to grave blunders and even to disaster. Reformism in the labor movement means the weakening of the working class. But even the most reformist bureaucracy is vitally concerned with maintaining the organized labor movement, for reformism cannot exist without it. The reformist bureaucracy cannot exist without it. Stalinism means the totalitarian strangulation and destruction of the labor movement. Wherever class-conscious militants are unable to challenge both in a directly independent form and are obliged to choose between the two evils, there is no question of which is the lesser evil of the two. A consciousness of this fact has enabled our party to function more effectively and more progressively in more than one fight in the labor movement. Maximum clarity on the problem of Stalinism in the labor movement is possible, however, only as a result of complete clarity about Stalinist Russia. The Canaanites are anything but alone in their confusion on this score. It is shared and multiplied many times over not only by the labor movement in general, but in particular by the leading men in it. Among our tasks is the dissipation of the dangerous confusion. Our party was the only one in this country to analyze and appraise correctly the great significance of the revolutionary, quote, national movements, end quote, that sprang up throughout Europe under the rule of German imperialism. Along with our German comrades who developed their standpoint independently of ours but in harmony with it, we have made a contribution on the, quote, national question, end quote, whose value will not diminish in the period ahead. In contrast, the futile word-mongering and sterile dogmatism of the Canaanites on this question has been typical of their helplessness when confronted with a new problem or an old problem in new form. They have not so thoroughly discounted disaccustomed themselves from critical independent thought and gone so far as converting Trotskyism from a guide to action and a means of arriving at a guide to action into a body of scriptural revelation that the most important revolutionary movement in the last 10 years could develop and shake all Europe without producing anything more than a stereotyped and utterly false reaction from the Socialist Workers' Party. Like the Socialist Labor Party, which answers all problems big and small with the mouth-filling demand for the, quote, unconditional surrender of capitalism, end quote, the Socialist Workers' Party avoids taking a position on the most urgent problems of the day by repeating, in season and out, its demands for the, quote, socialist United States of Europe, end quote. The struggle for democracy and for national freedom, which is increasingly the key to the struggle for socialism, is simply not grasped by the Canaanites. The Canaanites are paralyzed by some obscure fear that somehow or other the struggle for democracy carried on in a working class way with a working class program makes you a, quote, bourgeois democrat, end quote, who has given up the fight for socialism. That means, so far as the Socialist Workers' Party is concerned, that at least 4 men have worked in vain: Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. The last 30 years have been rich in events and in lessons for the working class, if not in victories. If we were asked to tell what makes us believe that the final victory will go to socialism, we would answer, capitalism has shown conclusively that capitalism cannot advance society and civilization, but only drive society and civilization further along the road of exhausting conflict, human degradation, barbarism, and ruin. It no longer has a capacity for stability, order, peace, and progress. The working class, even those sections of the working class that have been most cruelly oppressed, has shown a power of recuperation from defeat and resources of resistance to capitalist decay that amply justify our confidence in its eventual triumph. It has proved repeatedly that the conditions for its existence and progress is the struggle against the conditions of its existence. That is how it has been and how it must be. Although the connections to me. That's actually a very good line. The working class, even those sections of the working class that have been most cruelly oppressed, has shown a power of recuperation from defeat and resources of resistance to capitalist decay that amply justify our confidence in the working class's eventual triumph. The working class has proved repeatedly that the conditions for the working class's existence and progress is the struggle against the conditions of the working class's existence. That is how it has been and that is how it must be. Although the connections between conscious socialism and the working class were broken once by the old social democracy and again by Stalinism, they have not been destroyed. They exist in the form of our movement and its program, and they will be strengthened. The firmness of our party and the confirmation of our party's program by events justify the confidence we have in both. The firmness of our party and the confirmation of its program by events justify also our confidence that the Revolutionary International of the working class, a most important matter that cannot be dealt with briefly because it requires and deserves a chapter for itself, will be restored and solidified. What makes the struggle for socialism and freedom seem more difficult also makes it more urgently necessary. It simply makes no sense to us when we are told that encroaching capitalist barbarism is destroying the prospects of socialism and it is better to give up the fight. That is the talk of demoralized and spiritually vanquished serfs. It is precisely the fact that decomposing capitalism is filling the air with decomposing capitalism's poisonous fumes that imposes upon us the redoubling of our efforts to bury the putrid beast. Let the cowards flinch and the traitors sneer. Our minds are incapable of absorbing the truly monstrous idea that humanity, which has shown so often an irresistible passion for liberty and an inexhaustible capacity for achieving it progressively, when now at the historic pinnacle of its intellectual and social development, finally yield to the yoke and permanence, like brute cattle. We reiterate our faith in the people, in the working class, and dedicate ourselves again on this 5th anniversary to socialist emancipation. That's the end of the piece. Here are some end notes. Not the end of this recording, but the end of the piece from Shachtman. 1. The moralistic hue and cry that was raised when we continued to issue the new international under our own auspices is hard to imagine. It is only deplorable that Trotsky added his own voice to it. We had not only been the responsible editors and managers of the magazine, but generally speaking, the New International was our comrades who were most active in promoting the New International and who evaluated it properly. For the most part, the Canaanite leaders either ignored the New International or sneered at the New International openly as superfluous to the party and of interest only to a, quote, little gang of petty bourgeois intellectuals, end quote, as one of the Canaanite spokesmen said in our 1939 convention. The contempt these people really had for, quote, theory, end quote, was notorious in the party. In the long list of contributors to the magazine's many rich years, Cannon's name stands characteristically at the very bottom, as the author of 2 or 3 journalistic articles. Except for a couple of comrades in his entourage, the names of the others are not even on the list. In Cannon's recent History of American Trotskyism, the New International is mentioned a couple of times in the most casual way. Once with reference to one of the rare articles by Cannon, a second time with reference to its suspension upon our entry into the Socialist Party. In other words, Cannon has nothing whatsoever to say about New International as such, which, if we may be permitted, played such a decisive role in the development of the Trotskyist movement both here and abroad. This did not prevent Cannon in 1940 from threatening us with court action to get back the, quote, stolen, end quote, magazine, New International. A precedent for this threat, parenthesis, very wisely not carried out, end parenthesis, was the action of the right-wing socialist Ward Rogers in sending a sheriff's notice to the Trotskyists who, in the Socialist Party split, had taken with them some of the chairs belonging to a party local in the West. As for ourselves, we felt in perfectly good conscience about the New International, not only for the reasons given above, but because the New International represented a very modest part of what so large a section of the party as we constituted was entitled to have. We recommend to the attention of the protesters a reading of what Cannon wrote about Ward Rogers in the Socialist Appeal some 7 years ago. Again, this piece was labeled The Workers' Party After 5 Years by Max Shachtman, 1945. And it was originally titled, quote, 5 Years of the Workers' Party, end quote, published in New International, April 1945. Another passage from that text has been extracted and included at page 593. The next piece is titled, Why and How the 1940 Split Happened. It's by Max Shachtman and Ernest Rice McKinney. The Trotskyist movement in the United States split into 2 parts immediately after the National Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party in April 1940. The 2 principal differences which caused the split were first, the slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of Russia, end quote, in the war, upheld then by the then majority and rejected by the minority, and second, the regime in the Socialist Workers' Party which the minority criticized as being the regime in the Socialist Workers' Party which the minority criticized as bureaucratic conservatism. Rightly or wrongly, that is not the question at the moment. We shall return to it later. The minority was profoundly convinced of the tremendous harm that would be inflicted upon the movement by the exclusive presentation of the position of the majority on the Russian question. It was just as much convinced of the correctness of its own position and the need of presenting it to the radical working class public. That is why it insisted upon the right of publishing an organ of its own after the convention, which, while defending the party and the party's line in every sphere, would diverge from it on the question of the defense of Russia. This demand, while extraordinary, was not, however, unprecedented. The convention majority rejected it. Under extraordinary circumstances and given a normal party regime, the minority would undoubtedly have submitted to the decision of the majority. However, the minority believed that the circumstances were not ordinary and the party regime not normal. In the minority's view, the avowedly exceptional demand which it made was being converted by the majority into a convenient pretext for ridding itself of a substantial body of inconvenient and very embarrassing critics. The events that followed immediately after the convention only served to confirm the opinion of the minority. At the very first meeting of the political committee after the convention, after the newly elected National Committee had assigned the various comrades of the majority and minority to their various posts and responsibilities, the majority confronted the minority with a resolution which has no precedent whatsoever in the history of our movement. To find its equal, you must look in the annals not of the early Stalinist movement, but of the Stalinist movement in its worst period. This resolution did not charge the minority with any overt act against the party, not even with any act of indiscipline, not even the violation of the most insignificant rule or statute of the party. The first part of the resolution, in April 16, 1940, provided that, quote, that the committee accepts the convention decisions and obligates itself to carry those decisions out in a disciplined manner, end quote. We did not vote for this resolution. We did not vote against this resolution. We abstained from the above. It is not necessary for us to justify our abstention here. You may consider that we were entirely wrong in abstaining, but who can contest our inviolable right to have voted on this motion as we saw fit? Any member of the party at all times has the right to vote for or against a proposition or to abstain in the vote. If a majority can at any time dictate to a minority that the latter must vote for any proposition of the former, if a majority can at any time dictate to a minority that that minority must vote for any proposition of the majority, then obviously you no longer have a party, but a mechanical voting machine operating from above. Yet it was precisely this elementary right that was contested by the majority of the same meeting of the political committee. The second part of the resolution it submitted provided that anyone who fails to vote, quote, for, end quote, is automatically suspended from all party posts and rights in such a manner as to make the, quote, suspension, end quote, equivalent to all intents and purposes to an expulsion or, quote, suspension, end quote, without so much as a trial or hearing. And inasmuch as the minority in the political committee failed to vote, quote, for, end quote, the first proposition, it was declared automatically suspended from all posts and rights in the party. The same procedure was immediately practiced against all the supporters of the minority in the party branches. The Socialist Workers' Party was effectively split. Have you ever heard of such a procedure in all the history of our movement? Have you ever been told by the party leadership that this is the procedure it followed toward the minority in 1940? You know the answer to both questions. The first part of the infamous resolution was finally made public by the Socialist Workers' Party leadership in the introduction to Trotsky's In Defense of Marxism by Joseph Hansen and Ward. Why did they stop with the first part? Why didn't they make public the text to the second part in that introduction? Why has it never been made public anywhere else? Does your leadership feel a sense of shame at this blatant aping of the Stalinist principle that the price of membership in the party is a vote, quote, for, end quote? Does it feel that the publication of the second part of the resolution would give a truer picture of how the split in 1940 actually came about? That its publication would help dispel many of the legends which it has woven around the circumstances of the split? Your political committee statement speaks at great length about the 1940 split.
Why does it not give all the facts? Why does it not vote for its April 16th, 1940 resolution, or even refer to it? He who does not have the whole of the relevant facts cannot reach the whole of the relevant judgment. Demand that the resolution be made available to you in full. You are entitled to it. You have already spoken of the two main causes of the split, but it was the April 16th, 1940 resolution which actually precipitated the split. The plan of the majority to get rid of the critics of the party regime was clearly evident for them. The course and tone of the majority reflected a predetermined line for our expulsion. This required no special perspicacity on our part to anticipate an attempt to get rid of us on one pretext or another, although we admit we did not anticipate the measure would take such an outrageous form. We have no desire, therefore, to conceal the fact that we prepared for any eventuality so that no measure taken against us would catch us by surprise. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that this effective expulsion of the minority took place without any change whatsoever of discipline. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that this effective expulsion of the minority took place without any charge whatsoever of indiscipline. That it took place before we had published the first issue of Labor Action, that it took place before we published the first issue of the New International under our own auspices. Our expulsion was clearly the result of a plan to get rid of critics of the party regime on one flimsy pretext or another. As we saw it, and as we said at that time, an expulsion or split of the party should have and could have been averted if the majority had been genuinely and intelligently concerned with maintaining unity. That is the case even if every characterization of the minority held true, that it was, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, that it was, quote, yielding to the pressure of bourgeois public opinion, end quote, etc. During the Brest-Litovsk period of the Russian Revolution, the so-called left communists, headed by Bukharin, Radek, and others, published their own independent press and attacked the party and the party's leadership in the most violent and unrestrained terms. That was at a time when the fate of the revolution literally hung by a hair. Lenin characterized the left communists as, quote, petty bourgeois phrasemongers, end quote, and the like. Lenin had good, quote, petty bourgeois phrasemongers, end quote, and the like. Lenin had good grounds for this designation. They formed a bloc for all practical purposes with the left SRs, a non-Marxist petty bourgeois current. He spared them as little as they spared him, but Lenin proposed no organizational measures against the clear violation of the party's statutes by the left communists. Lenin did not propose a formal banning of the left communist independent press and party committees. Although not an advocate of unity at all costs, Lenin was sincerely and wisely concerned with unity. Lenin had confidence in the power of his own views, confidence that his own views would persuade at least the bulk of the left communists in good time. When Bukharin refused to serve on the Central Committee because of the differences, Lenin insisted that Bukharin remain a member, right in the face of the fact that Bukharin had set up a, quote, rival press and, quote, rival party committees. Before too long, not only did Lenin's views triumph, but Lenin's method triumphed as well. The breach was healed, party unity was restored, the crisis was overcome with a minimum of damage. Naturally, the situation in the Socialist Workers' Party in 1940 was not identical with that of the Bolshevik Party in 1918. Everything must be examined with due regard for the differences in proportion. But if anything, Lenin's method was even more clearly indicated for 1940 in the United States than for 1918 in Russia. The fate of the revolution in the United States did not hang by a hair in 1940. Again, this piece was titled Why and How the 1940 Split Happened by Max Shachtman and Ernest Rice McKinney. Extracts from it. They were extracts from an open letter to the convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, published in Labor Action, 11th of November, 1946. The next piece is titled Why We Wanted Our Own Periodical, and it's by Max Shachtman and Ernest Rice McKinney. It's from 1946. Why was the minority so insistent on the minority's proposal that, if defeated at the convention, it would have the right to publish a periodical of the kind we have described?
In a letter of February 20th, 1940 to the Cleveland Conference of the Opposition, Comrade Trotsky wrote us that, quote, the future minority can ask for certain reasonable guarantees for the future minority's ideological existence, and we believe that the future majority should grant these reasonable guarantees in order to prevent a premature, not unavoidable split, end quote. The difficulty, however, lay in the fact that the minority believed that the presentation of the minority's point of view on the vital question of the Russian defense slogan to the radical working class public was necessary in order to moderate the disastrous consequences of the majority position on this question, that only in that way could the minority remain loyal to the minority's ideas and the interests of the working class and thereby to the Fourth International itself. But not only that, the trouble lay further in the fact that the majority not only offered no, quote, reasonable guarantees, end quote, but that our bitter experience during the dispute in the party had already removed any grounds that we may have had for placing confidence in any, quote, guarantees, end quote, of genuine party democracy that the majority might give us. The reason for this conclusion cannot be better stated than by quoting from a document issued by the minority on the 9th of March, 1940, quote, is there the slightest ground for believing that the Canaanites would grant us, if we proved to be in the minority at the convention, those, quote, reasonable guarantees for ideological existence, end quote, of which Trotsky speaks? For what reason should any party member place the slightest confidence in the loyalty or in the adherence to the principles of party democracy of the Cannon clique? It sought at the very beginning to prevent a discussion entirely, calling it a, quote, luxury we cannot afford, end quote. When it was finally compelled to open a discussion, Cannon moved that it be confined to one membership meeting of the New York local. Although the last political committee meeting steamrolled through a motion, quote, recommending, end quote, another discussion debate membership meeting of the New York local, parenthesis, we proposed to refer the question to the city committee, whose record in organizing the fullest and most democratic discussion is flawless, and which has since organized the meeting, quote, recommended, end quote, by the political committee. The same Canaanite political committee has never voted to, quote, recommend the holding of a discussion debate membership meeting at the Minneapolis or Flint locals. Just the contrary. The Canaanite controlling Michigan-Ohio District Committee has just sabotaged to death the district membership meeting at which official representative of the two groups were to debate before the Youngstown, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, Flint membership. The internal bulletins have been progressively, quote, weighted, end quote, against the minority's documents and articles, especially in the latest issues. Now the bulletin is, in effect, completely suspended. The socialist appeal has denied to the minority in the socialist appeal was denied to the minority in the pre-convention period on purely Stalinist grounds. Instead of a discussion in the socialist appeal's columns, the Canaanites have devoted themselves in editorials and articles to a dirty, insinuatory, underhanded, and disloyal polemic against us without our having the opportunity to reply. Quote, a petty, typically Stalinist censorship of articles has been introduced against the minority in the appeal, specifically against the column of Comrade Dwight MacDonald, who was not even allowed to quote the official Stalinist statement that the Kremlin does not aim to Sovietize Finland. Even the New International was closed to the minority. On the most hypocritical and demagogical grounds, the last issue is filled with the Canaanite position without a word appearing from our side. At the last minute, a decision is made to make the coming issue of the New International a, quote, discussion, end quote, number, which will appear just in time to greet the delegates after they have been elected. In this, quote, model, end quote, discussion number, at least 2/3 of the space is to be given the majority position. This decision is presented as a, quote, concession, end quote, to the minority. Fraudulent claim. Its purpose is not the preservation of the democratic rights of the minority, but the preparation of the split, on the eve of driving us out of the party. The Canaanites are preparing the sympathizers of the party by making public, among other documents, Trotsky's fierce attack on the minority. Quote, from a scratch to gangrene, end quote, which is on this channel. Trotsky's authority and prestige are being used in the hope of, quote, discrediting, end quote, the minority, of psychologizing the party sympathizers into accepting the already prepared expulsions. Quote, Who can seriously ask the minority to place the slightest confidence in the Canaanites after this? What are the, quote, reasonable, end quote, guarantees they offer? Their reply to our resolution on party unity simply does not offer any. Trotsky speaks of the, quote, exceptional, end quote, situation. Cannon replies, submit and shut up. That is one of the main reasons why the minority insists on the right of either group, if it is not victorious at the convention, to publish a political organ if it so desires, end quote. No, we did not contend then, and we do not say now that the regular statutes of the party provide for the issuance of any public organs by a minority of the party. Statutes, however, do not exist as an end in themselves. Statutes should be enforced at all times, but enforced intelligently, and always with an eye to the best interests of the party. To grant any group of comrades the right to a public organ of its own, and every time it decides that it wants one, merely in order to try to preserve party unity or some measure of party unity, in contrast to a definitive split, would obviously be absurd. We take no such position, and we never did. It's necessary to weigh the choices with the most scrupulous objectivity. To go by the pure party statutes in a case where a minority insists on that minority's special demand, and the majority rigidly insist upon the letter of the statutes, obviously means a definitive split, probably of long duration. Obviously, this is an evil. To yield on the formal aspects of the statutes in the same case certainly means a loosening of the party cords. Here, too, obviously, there is an evil. But such a loosening may, given a wise and politically self-confident majority, avoid a complete disruption of those bonds and lay the basis for re-examining them at an earlier stage. The weighing of the two must be undertaken in order to arrive at a scrupulous decision on which is the greater evil and which is the lesser. Can any serious and objective comrade say now, especially now in the light of the 6 years' development of the two groups, that the 1940 majority arrived at a scrupulously objective decision? On the one side, there was a decision which could have healed the breach in a roundabout and even painful way. On the other side was the split of the Trotskyist movement into almost two equal parts. Surely you cannot deceive yourselves into really believing that the minority was composed of, quote, worthless petty bourgeois scum, end quote. Naturally, we had some petty bourgeois riffraff in our ranks. Every minority that launches a fight against, among other things, bureaucratism attracts to that minority's side a certain amount of petty bourgeois or dilettante camp followers. Whoever knows the history of the Trotskyist struggle against Stalinist bureaucracy knows this to be a fact. We got rid of these camp followers without much difficulty, but the overwhelming bulk of the minority was made up of devoted revolutionists, capable of enduring struggle against the class enemy and for revolutionary socialist principles. It was made up of comrades who played no small role in founding and building up the Trotskyist movement in this country and elsewhere, and in acting as its most loyal and not least competent defenders. It had the support of what your political committee now acknowledges to have been almost 50% of the party, and even a greater percentage of the youth, a support which it was not easy to gain in the face of the great authority enjoyed by our only real opponent, Comrade Trotsky. Faced with the choice of trying to retain unity with this considerable and important section of the Trotskyist movement on the one hand, and a split with a, quote, line of blood between us, end quote, as your leader said, on the other hand, the majority did not hesitate. It decided on the cold, calculated split. Those are the facts of the split, for which we are ready to take our share of the responsibility, even though it is now a more or less outlived question, but only our share. Again, this piece was labeled Why We Wanted Our Own Periodical by Max Shachtman and Ernest Rice McKinney. And this extract from an open letter to the Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, Labor Action, 11th of October, 1946. The next piece is from 1945 and is labeled, at least, "We Must Deepen the Split with the Workers' Party" by James P. Cannon. This is from, quote, "Reflections on the 11th Party Convention," end quote. Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 7, Number 2, April 1945. In discussing every difference of opinion and every proposal, we should aim to carry our thoughts through to the end and draw the whole party into our thinking. For this it is necessary not only to explain to the party what is proposed, but why it is proposed. The characteristic defect of all eclectic thinking, is that it is only half thinking. It is marked by the failure to carry a thought through to the end, the tendency to jump to conclusions and formulate proposals midway in the consideration of a subject. Take the question of the Shachtmanites, for example. We witness an attempt, direct or implied, to revise our estimate of the petty bourgeois opposition. But the question is not ended with our estimate of the Shachtman party. It is only started. What follows from this estimate or the proposal to revise it? To what end is it pointed? If we keep thinking without stopping halfway, we must recognize that our estimate inexorably leads us either (1) and toward reconciliation and unity, or (2) and I don't know why I'm saying that. Or 2, towards a deepening of the split. The discussion is not completed until that question is decided and reasons given for the decision. We, on our part, assume that the course toward deepening of the split is necessary and correct. Our attitude flows from that. Naturally, if someone has a different proposal, we are ready to discuss it. But if that is the case, let us discuss fully and properly in logical order from premise to conclusion. Let us go back to the internal struggle and the split in which it culminated, and put the following questions as a basis for the discussion. 1. Was the analysis of the petty bourgeois opposition which we, together with Trotsky, made at that time correct or not? 2. Was the attitude which we took toward them properly based on the analysis? 3. Was our action in expelling the minority, or I guess what he referred to, the petty bourgeois opposition, when the petty bourgeois opposition refused to accept the convention decisions, the proper action? 4. What changes have taken place in the meantime? Has the Shachtman party come closer or gone further away from us? 5. Do these changes provide the logical ground to reassert and strengthen our original decision, or to change or modify it? Do I hear an answer to these questions? By all means, let us discuss the, quote, Workers' Party, if anyone else really wants to discuss the, quote, Workers' Party. But let us not nibble at the proposition. Let it be fully discussed to the end. Again, that piece was labeled "We Must Deepen the Split with the Workers' Party" by James P. Cannon, and it's from Reflections on the 11th Party Convention from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 7, Number 2, April 1945. The next piece is titled "Answers to Comrade Cannon's Questions on the Workers' Party." By Albert Goldman, 1945. This is from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 7, Number 5, June 1945, and was written on May 7th, 1945. In the Internal Bulletin of April 1945, Comrade Cannon poses 5 questions dealing with our past and present estimate of the Workers' Party. A 6th question is added by Cannon in a tone of triumph, as if no one will dare take up this challenge. That question is, do I hear an answer on these questions? I hope Comrade Cannon, quote, hears the answers that I am giving to his Comrade Cannon's questions. Question 1. Quote, was the analysis of the petty bourgeois opposition, which we together with Trotsky made at the time, correct or not? End quote. Answer, yes. Question 2. Quote, was the attitude which we took toward them properly based on that analysis? End quote. Answer, what attitude does Cannon mean? Did the party adopt a resolution officially indicating the proper attitude towards the minority that split from us? Did the party adopt a resolution designating the members who were expelled as renegades? If such a thing was done, I am completely unaware of it. As far as I was concerned, our attitude toward the minority was one of struggle against the minority on the basis of their incorrect theory on the defense of the Soviet Union and their criminal conduct in splitting from the party when they were given the right to have their own faction and factional organ. I probably wrote at least as many articles against Shachtman as any other member of the party. True, I did not call him names. I let Comrade Hansen and other comrades do that. I merely presented arguments. Question 3. Quote, was our action in expelling them when they refused to accept the convention decisions the proper action? End quote. Answer, 1,000 times yes. Question 4. Quote, what changes have taken place in the meantime? Has the Shachtman party come closer or gone farther away from us? End quote. It is obvious that the answer to this question touches the heart of the problem and should indicate to us what attitude we should take to the former minorityeites. It must be divided into several sections. A. The important event that occurred after the split was the entry of the United States into the World War. Thereupon, from a revolutionary Marxist standpoint, every party and every group pretending to march under the banner of revolutionary socialism was subjected to the most serious test. Next to the revolution itself, the best and most serious test for our party, claiming to base itself on the principles of revolutionary Marxism, is an imperialist war on the part of its own bourgeoisie. The attitude of a party towards its own imperialist bourgeoisie during a war is a decisive test of the seriousness with which such a party takes its convictions. In his polemic against Burnham, Trotsky remarked that should any of the American opponents of the dialectic reveal a self-sacrifice and independence from patriotism, similar to that of Karl Liebknecht, we shall render what is due him as a revolutionist. Lenin was ready to applaud all socialists who adopted a revolutionary position in the First World War. When the Workers' Party refused to support the American bourgeoisie in this war, we should have been the first to give the Workers' Party the credit the Workers' Party deserved. One does not need to be a profound student of Lenin and Trotsky to know how scrupulous Lenin and Trotsky were in giving an opponent credit for a correct position on an important question. The attitude of Cannon in failing to do this is the very opposite of this. Because of the circumstances under which the Burnham-Shachtman group refused to defend the Soviet Union during the Soviet Union's war with Finland, we asserted that it yielded to the pressure of the democratic bourgeoisie. Although the minority refused to defend Finland, the minority's attitude to the Soviet Union resembled the attitude of the petty bourgeois Democrats, and the conclusion was plausible that it yielded to the pressure of that social layer in society. But the bourgeois democratic pressure exerted on all socialist groups was infinitely greater after the United States entered the war. Norman Thomas yielded to that pressure immediately and went over to a war position. If a group had actually become part of the democratic world, it could not possibly have withstood the pressure and would have gone over to a pro-war position. In fact, to be against the defense of the Soviet Union, an ally of American imperialism, became more difficult than to favor its defense. On the basis of our assertion that the minority had yielded to democratic pressure during the Finnish-Soviet conflict, some comrades predicted that Shachtmanites would go over completely to the side of the bourgeois Democrats. That was, of course, a complete vulgarization of the Marxist method and was to be expected. Comrade Hansen took first prize among the vulgarizers. In an article published in Fourth International of February 1941, the pamphlet Joseph Hansen gave Shachtman a few months in which to catch up and outstrip Burnham. Parenthesis, I presume Hansen will answer that his error is one of tempo. End parenthesis. Even such a serious crime as splitting from the Fourth International can be partly expiated by taking a revolutionary position during an imperialist war. B. In our present estimate of the Workers' Party, one must not ignore the important fact of the separation of Burnham and Burnham's followers from that party. It was Burnham who largely set the tone of the minorities of 1939 to 40. From the fact that Burnham left the Workers' Party soon after the Workers' Party was organized, the conclusion can justifiably be drawn that Burnham worked for a split during the factional struggle, and once the split was achieved, left the new party in the lurch. Burnham leaving the new group was an important factor in keeping the Shachtmanites on the road of the proletarian revolution. With his departure, the members of the minority who had devoted many years to the revolutionary movement freed themselves from an anti-revolutionary element. Instead of prophesying, as Comrade Hansen did, that Shachtman would follow Burnham, an intelligent Marxist would have expressed the hope that Shachtman and the others, having gotten rid of Burnham, would find it easier to remain on the path of revolution. Dwight MacDonald's dissociation from the Workers' Party, while not having the important influence that Burnham's leaving had, was an indication that those who were consciously anti-Bolshevik were finding it difficult to remain in the new party. C. A large proportion of the minority of 1939 to 40 consisted of non-proletarian youth. Their separation from the problems actually confronting the workers created an unhealthy atmosphere where the necessity for discussion tended to be overemphasized. On the basis of the fact that the Workers' Party had no roots in the trade union movement, some comrades predicted that at best the Workers' Party would never be more than a propaganda group, and most comrades prophesied as an early demise for the new party. The expansion of industry as a result of the war, plus an undoubted policy of proletarianization, transformed a good many of the declassed youth of the minority into workers. My judgment, based on a reading of the Workers' Party press, is that the Workers' Party has made some gains from the activity of their members in the trade unions. I know that this runs contrary to the assertions of most of our comrades, but none of these comrades has taken the trouble to explain how a disintegrated party can continue to publish a weekly and a monthly. It is impossible to explain this fact if one accepts the picture of disintegration that some of our comrades give us of the Workers' Party. That they have not made those gains we have made is certain, but it is not certain that they have lost in membership. Because the minority had a proportionately larger number of youth than we did, it is very likely that they lost a proportionately large number to the armed forces. Without recruiting some new members, it is unlikely that the minority could have continued to publish a weekly and a monthly theoretical organ. Furthermore, the fact that labor action consciously attempts to orient itself to trade union workers is additional evidence that the Workers' Party is active in the trade unions and has made some gains. The question of the nature of the activities of the Workers' Party in the trade unions and the correctness of the Workers' Party's policies is completely irrelevant. Even if the Workers' Party members were as adventurous as some comrades claim they are, and that is difficult to believe, judging by their press, I would not be impressed by such an argument. Most young and inexperienced revolutionists tend towards leftism in trade union work. I shall not hold youth and experience against any revolutionist. Some comrades who are in a position to know claim that the Shachtmanites are stronger than we are in the trade unions of the New York area. They have played a larger role than we have in the recent conventions of some important trade unions. That is, of course, because of our, quote, policy of caution, end quote. Nevertheless, it proves that we are active in the trade unions. That they are active in the trade unions. What is important is that the non-proletarian youth, whom we justly criticized at the time they were in our party, have shown a seriousness of purpose which we did not expect. Because they are very articulate, intellectual youth in the trade union movement are very valuable once they are cured of ultra-leftism and adventurism. In judging the character of the Workers' Party, and in determining our attitude to the membership of that party, we must by all means take into consideration that the group which we thought would never have anything to do with trade union work has made serious attempts to orient itself to such work and in some instances has achieved some success. D. Certain aspects of the present program of the Workers' Party have undoubtedly, in a formal sense, widened the gulf between us and the former minorities. It is necessary to analyze each of these aspects and to determine the essential question whether or not the Workers' Party cannot be considered a revolutionary Marxist party because of their differences with us on some important questions. Of course, some comrades will contend that refusal to defend the Soviet Union immediately transforms one into an anti-Marxist. But if this is so, why were we willing to permit, quote, anti-Marxists, end quote, to remain in the party and grant them the right of a faction? There are very important questions upon which Marxists can differ and even split without ceasing to be Marxists. Some comrades should remember that Trotsky and Lenin differed on the very important question of dictatorship of the proletariat versus democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. But it occurred to neither one to call the other an anti-Marxist because of their differences on this question. The Workers' Party considers the Soviet Union a bureaucratic collectivist state. Only Burnham and Carter had that viewpoint at the time of the split. Bracket, see Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, page 292 for a different account, and bracket. Undoubtedly, the official position of the Workers' Party on that question means that the minorities are farther away from us now than they were at the time of our struggle with them. But it is necessary to remember that Burnham and Carter were members of our party for several years, while Burnham and Carter held to that view of the Soviet Union, and it occurred to no one to suggest that Burnham and Carter be expelled. It may well be that after capitalism should be restored in the Soviet Union, the Shachtmanites will still consider it to be a bureaucratic collectivist state. It would be downright insanity if, all other factors permitting, two groups would refuse to unite because one considers the Soviet Union a capitalist state and the other a bureaucratic collectivist state. E. If, on the question of the nature of the Soviet Union, the gulf between the SWP and the WP has been deepened, this is not true at present in the case of the more important question of the defense of the Soviet Union. For the time being, we all agree that the military defense of the Soviet Union has receded into the background. According to Comrade Gundiza Muniz, it is hardly probable that the question of the defense of the Soviet Union will come up again in as sharp a form as it confronted us in 1939. But be that as it may, there's not a single voice in opposition to the view that all our efforts must now be concentrated on the defense of the European Revolution against Stalin. On this question, there is no difference between us and the Workers' Party. Nevertheless, if reunited the two parties were to be proposed, the question of the defense of the Soviet Union would still be the most important question, for so long as we believe in defending the Soviet Union in any case of any imperialist attack. Nevertheless, if reuniting the two parties were to be proposed, the question of the defense of the Soviet Union would still be the most important question. For so long as we believe in defending the Soviet Union in case of any imperialist attack, there is still the possibility of our using the slogan. What sense would there be in uniting if, tomorrow, the same struggle that took place in 1939 to 40 were to be renewed? Personally, I do not believe that unity is a practical proposition so long as there is a fair probability that the defense of the Soviet Union will once more be placed by us on the order of the day. Nevertheless, it must not be taken as absolutely certain that the former minorities would not be willing to return to the party under the same conditions that we offered them in 1940 in order to keep them from splitting the party. Had they agreed to accept discipline and action, we would have given them proportionate representation on the various leading committees, with the right to have a faction and a factional organ. It is now 5 years since they have split. They have had their experience outside the party. The slogan of the defense of the Soviet Union is not the burning question that it was in 1940. It is therefore necessary for us to ask the Workers' Party members to return to the party and accept the same conditions that we proposed to grant them in 1940. Such an offer would serve the interests of our party either in case of acceptance or rejection. Should the former minorities accept, our forces would be strengthened by the addition of about 400 members, many of whom are able people with long experience in the revolutionary movement. Their return to the party would eliminate a group which confuses many workers who cannot see the difference between us and the Workers' Party. Should they, however, reject our offer, we would have a powerful argument to disprove their contention that our party is a, quote, bureaucratic jungle, end quote. They would be in an exceedingly difficult position to defend their organizational criticism of our party, and the likelihood is that they would lose many of their members to us. It should be clear, however, that our estimate of the Workers' Party is not to be determined by the fact that unity is impossible because of our differences on the question of the defense of the Soviet Union. It does not follow that, because unity is impossible, the members of the Workers' Party are renegades. It does not follow, because unity is impossible at present, that we should not collaborate with the Workers' Party, wherever and whenever possible, on the trade union and on the political field. To harbor a permanent grudge because of our differences on the defense of the Soviet Union and because of the split is infantile. F. Since the split, 3 questions have arisen upon which we took a position contrary to that taken by the Workers' Party. We decided to continue giving support to China in China's struggle against Japanese imperialism after the United States entered the war, while the Workers' Party took a position against material support. The Workers' Party favored raising the slogan of national liberation for the countries occupied by Hitler's armies. We opposed that slogan. Whereas our party adopted the slogan of military training under trade union control, the Workers' Party rejected that slogan. All these questions are such that differences could be expected with reference to them in the same party. Recently, the majority of the Fourth Internationalists in India took a position against supporting China. On the national question, there are differences in our own ranks. The same is true of the slogan for military training under trade union control. Some English comrades are strenuously opposed to the slogan. Undoubtedly, our differences with the Workers' Party on the 3 questions mentioned above are important, but those differences are not at all of a nature which in the course of a party discussion could not be solved by a majority decision with the acceptance by the minority of the decision of the majority. Again, this is from May 7th, 1945, from the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 7, Number 5, June 1945. And this piece was titled or labeled Answer to Comrade Cannon's Questions on the Workers' Party by Albert Goldman, 1945. Excuse me, burpsy. The next piece is by Albert Goldman, Felix Morrow, and Oscar Williams, and is labeled "What We Said Would Happen and What Did Happen." This was published in New International in 1945. It is now more than 5 years since the groups which we designate as the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, left the Socialist Workers' Party. Immediately after the split, the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, organized the Workers' Party under the leadership of comrades with many years of experience in the revolutionary movement. After 5 years, we note that their activities in the labor movement continued unabated. The Workers' Party published a weekly agitational paper, Labor Action, and a monthly, New International, put up candidates in elections, conduct fraction work in the trade unions, etc. They took with them in the split 40% of our membership. Their present activities indicate that they have retained a substantial portion of this number and recruited new elements. 2. Assuming that the Workers' Party is but 1/3 the size of our party, we cannot ignore the possibility of reunification of the two forces on the ground of their allegedly sparse numbers. Unification would result in a 25% increase of our forces. More important, unification would return to the party some cadre elements who are the product of decades of Marxist training and experience and whom we cannot hope to recruit elsewhere. 3. Our attitude toward reunification must be based on a political estimate of the Workers' Party. This means not to repeat what we said about the minority at the time of the split, but to analyze without prejudice the history of the Workers' Party and the character of the Workers' Party's program and present activities. 4. With the exception of the important questions of the nature and defense of the Soviet Union, the Workers' Party remains on the fundamental programmatic basis of the Fourth International. Its propaganda, agitation, and activities are based in the main on the program of transitional demands adopted by the founding conference of the Fourth International. 5. The acid test of a Workers' Party is its attitude towards imperialist war. Without the slightest hesitation and with no opposition in its ranks, the Workers' Party took a Leninist position towards its own imperialist bourgeoisie. The Workers' Party has maintained that position throughout the war. Some comrades deny that this is an acid test of the revolutionary character of the Workers' Party. They point to the anti-war position of Julius Martov in World War I and the Young People's Socialist League in this war as examples of centrist and/or non-revolutionists who oppose the imperialist war. The speciousness of this argument is that it ignores the fact that Martov and the YPSL remain in parties dominated by social chauvinists, whereas the Leninist character of the Workers' Party's position includes the Workers' Party's recognition of the principle that Leninists must have their own party and cannot remain in one party with social chauvinists. 6. The comrades of the Workers' Party have shown that they remain loyal to the proletarian revolution. On the American scene, the Workers' Party has followed the same general course as our party, against the no-strike pledge and against class collaboration through the War Labor Board, for a Labor Party, etc. On questions of the European Revolution, it has likewise followed the same course as we, and similarly on tasks of liberation of the colonies. Today, the similarity of the two parties' programs and activities has become still closer, with the disappearance into the background of the question of the defense of the Soviet Union and the appearance in the foreground of the urgent need to defend the European revolutions against Stalin, a question on which the Workers' Party is in complete agreement with us. It is inevitable that militant workers will not understand our separation into parties which they deem to be similar in fundamental program and immediate aim, nor can we justly deny to these militant workers the essentially revolutionary character of the Workers' Party. 7. The Workers' Party position on the Soviet Union is that it is a bureaucratic collectivist state. However, this does not constitute an insuperable obstacle to unity. Within the Fourth International, there have for some years been currents rejecting the concept that the USSR is a degenerated worker state. Nobody has claimed that the Fourth International must expel comrades who believe the Soviet Union is a bureaucratic collectivist state or a state of capitalist restoration. 8. There are comrades of the political committee who, while agreeing to the principle that differences on the Soviet Union are no bar to unity within the Fourth International, nevertheless argue that the comrades of the Workers' Party do not belong in the Fourth International because they are, quote, revisionists, end quote. But revisionist in the classical sense refers to reformists of the type of Bernstein who distort Marxism for the purpose of giving up the class struggle and the proletarian revolution. The, quote, revisionism, end quote, of the Workers' Party is obviously not to be confused with Bernsteinian revisionism. The revisionism of the Workers' Party is a revision of the Marxist theory of the state in the sense that the Workers' Party theory of bureaucratic collectivism is not compatible with the Marxist theory of the state, but we must recognize that the Workers' Party agrees with us against Bernsteinian revisionism on the necessity of carrying on the class struggle to proletarian revolution, and denies that it has abandoned the Marxist theory of the state, whereas revisionists took no bones about their abandonment of it. Only those bewitched by words can fail to distinguish between Bernsteinian revisionism, which has no place in the Fourth International, and the, quote, revisionism, end quote, of those who differ with us on the Soviet Union, who do have a place in the Fourth International, and actually have a place in several of the parties of the Fourth International. 9. Another argument against unity is that the quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, opposition has continued to move further and further away from us since the split. This abstract spatial metaphor is not a valid political proposition. It is true that several political differences have arisen in the past 5 years between the positions of our party and that of the Workers' Party, but neither singularly nor together are they a bar to unity. There are differences on the question of material aid to China, on some phases of our military policy, on our attitude to the Stalinist parties, differences on the national question in Europe during the Nazi occupation may also still exist to a certain extent. But differences in all these questions must be expected with comrades in our own or sister parties of the Fourth International. They are not questions upon which difference of opinion can be expected to lead to a split, assuming the disputants to be genuine Bolsheviks and sensible. On some of these questions, we had differences in our own ranks, and no serious factional struggle resulted. Moreover, many of those in the Workers' Party who differ with us on these questions would be influenced by our arguments were they to be in our party. Much of these differences can be laid to the existence of two separate parties. Perhaps also many of our comrades would be influenced by the arguments of the Workers' Party comrades if they returned. But this is natural and to be expected. He who objects to unity on the ground of these differences and possible future differences will only find satisfaction in a monolithic party, a party without differences, which in reality would not be a party at all. 10. Another argument against unity is that the very fact that the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition and, quote, split from us shows the petty bourgeois, quote, petty bourgeois opposition do not belong in the same party with us. This argument amounts to saying that once we have split, there should never be unity again. It is completely alien to the method of Trotsky, who so often attempted to heal splits in the parties of the Fourth International. Following earlier unsuccessful attempts by Trotsky, our French comrades have recently succeeded in healing a 9-year split with the millennialists. Our Belgian comrades have again offered unity to the Fariken group, with whom they have more long-standing and far deeper differences than we have with the Workers' Party. The fact that the comrades of the Workers' Party split from us is irrelevant to the question of unity now. 11. The political committee insists on continuing to characterize the Workers' Party as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, to use that as an argument against unity. Quote, when did they change, end quote, is the argument against those who say that unity is possible now. A date is demanded of us. We cannot give it, but we can indicate precisely in what the change consists. A. Our characterization of them as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, was based mainly on the fact that we considered they had yielded to bourgeois democratic pressure in abandoning the defense of the Soviet Union during the period of the Stalin-Hitler Pact, when bourgeois democratic public opinion was hostile to the Soviet Union. But had they continued to yield to democratic public opinion, they would not have adopted a Leninist position on the war, a position which indicated that the comrades of the Workers' Party were capable of resisting far greater pressure than was exerted during the Stalin-Hitler Pact. B. In the split, Burnham was the ideological leader of the petty bourgeois opposition. But Burnham left the Workers' Party, and with Burnham also a small group influenced by Burnham's anti-Marxist theories. Likewise, Dwight MacDonald, an anti-Bolshevik, did not find himself at home in the Workers' Party. The departure of these elements was an important factor in permitting the group to remain on the fundamental position of the Fourth International instead of taking the path first indicated by Burnham. C. During the war, the petty bourgeois elements of the Workers' Party found jobs in industry, and many of the petty bourgeois elements in the Workers' Party had their first experience in fighting in the ranks of organized workers. They undoubtedly made many mistakes because of inexperience, but we cannot deny their seriousness of purpose and their devotion to the labor movement. We can also expect that the large number of their members drafted into the army have undergone a significant transformation through their experience with masses in the war. These are the specific changes which answer the formalistic question as to when the Workers' Party ceased to be a petty bourgeois group. 12. Even if it had remained a petty bourgeois group, that would be no principled obstacle to unity, for even when we characterized them as petty bourgeois opposition, the party was willing to keep them in its ranks. Although the organizational question was raised in the form of an indictment of the canon regime as a basic conservative tendency, and although that question played an important role in the struggle culminating in the split, the basis of the struggle was the question of the defense of the Soviet Union. Under the guidance of Trotsky, we took the position that a split on the question was not justified, that it was possible and desirable for the minority to accept discipline in action and to strive further to win the majority of the membership of its point of view. Trotsky proposed that the minority be given guarantees that factions would not be prohibited, that no restrictions would be imposed on factional activity other than those dictated by the necessity for common action, that the minority could choose to have an internal bulletin of the minority's own or a common bulletin with the majority. The minority demanded the right to publish a public newspaper agitating against the party position. This right the majority rejected as irreconcilable with Bolshevik procedure. The split occurred because the minority violated the convention decision denying it permission to publish a public organ. It is clear from the facts that have led to the split that either the elimination by history of the question of the defense of the Soviet Union, or a willingness on the part of the comrades of the Workers' Party to accept the conditions proposed by Trotsky to avoid the split, should lead to a serious attempt at reunification. 14. The question of the defense of the Soviet Union has not been eliminated by history, but it is no longer the burning question that the defense of the Soviet Union was in 1940. The burning question today is the defense of the European Revolution from Stalin, on which both parties agree. This creates the possibility of working together again in one party. No one can say if and when we are likely to bring to the fore again the slogan of defense of the USSR. The variant of a fairly long term of peace between the imperialists and Stalin is more likely to occur than the variant of war. At any rate, it is necessary to invite the Workers' Party comrades to re-enter our ranks, offering them the same conditions that we were willing to offer them in order to avoid the split. 15. How the Workers' Party will react to such an invitation is not certain. The important thing is to work out a correct line for our party on this question, to invite the Workers' Party to unite with us on the same conditions we offered in 1940. We shall benefit no matter what attitude this Workers' Party takes. A refusal on the Workers' Party's part can be utilized to tear away some of their supporters within and outside their party. Acceptance means increasing our membership by several hundred, among whom are capable comrades with many years of experience in the revolutionary movement. It means eliminating a party whose existence side by side with ours causes much confusion. 16. An attitude which condemns those who split to permanent separation from the party, regardless of their loyalty to the revolution, is incompatible with the true spirit of Bolshevism. In the course of building a Bolshevik party, sharp differences of opinion, even bitter struggle and splits, are almost unavoidable. Unification after a split, when tempers have cooled, when events have eliminated or pushed to the background the cause of the controversy, is just as obligatory as refraining from splitting. We correctly characterize the splits as a criminal blunder against the movement, but that does not justify us in forever barring the door to those who left us. "17. The unwillingness to unite with comrades who have different opinions has nothing in common with Bolshevism. Such unwillingness bases itself on the concept of a monolithic party whose leaders, while granting formal democratic rights of discussion, do not in reality conceive differences of opinion, and discussions of the differences is a method of building a healthy Bolshevik party. They do not have confidence in their ability to convince intelligent revolutionists. They depend upon blind followers. Building the party to them is to create a machine with a membership that is docile and accepts unquestioningly the directives of the leaders. The question of unification with the comrades of the Workers' Party is thus of enormous symptomatic importance in determining the kind of party we want to build. The party's decision will be a touchstone indicating the direction in which we shall henceforth move." Again, this piece is titled "What We Said Would Happen and What Did Happen," by Albert Goldman, Felix Morrow, and Oscar Williams. Published in 1945, originally in New International, September 1945. The next piece is titled "I Was Unready in 1940. It's by Max Shachtman. It's from 1943. It's from a Workers' Party bulletin circa summer 1943. During the Russian discussion prior to the split in the Socialist Workers' Party, there were two more or less definitive standpoints on the class character of the Soviet state. There was Trotsky's view, supported by the Cannonites. There was also the Carter or Carter-Burnham point of view that Russia was not a worker state. As some comrades know, the war and Russia's role in it helped to upset my own views on the working class character of Russia. I did not at first adopt the standpoint that Russia was not a worker state. I simply began to have doubts about the old position. To be certain of it, the only correct word Hansen ever said in that factional fight was that Shachtman represents the, quote, doubtist faction, end quote, on this question. Hansen was essentially correct, but I took my responsibility as a leader seriously enough, if I may say so, not to engage at that time in a discussion of the class character of the Russian state. What could I contribute to a discussion on that question between Burnham and Cannon or Carter and Trotsky? Only one thing. I am in doubt. I am not sure of my position. How would such nonsense have helped make a discussion on the class character of the Russian state fruitful? The membership would have been 100% right in telling me, if you don't know, if you have nothing but doubts, then be silent and don't mess things up until you know where you stand. I didn't wait for anyone to give me this counsel. I deliberately avoided that discussion. I refused to be dragged into it, at least so far as I was concerned. Parenthesis. There were, of course, other reasons of a more general group nature which indicate to us the wrongness of such a discussion at that time, but they had nothing to do with my personal case. I waited. I discussed time and again with comrades holding all sorts of views on the question. I re-examined the question to the best of my ability by studying all the available material, restudying, checking, and rechecking. If I finally appeared before the party membership with a position of my own, it was only after I knew where I stood and that I could defend (or try to defend) my views before the party membership and the radical workers in general. I like to think that this procedure and conduct helped to make the fundamental discussion that ensued a more fruitful and positive one. In this personal conference, the reader will surely understand there is no element of boastfulness or self-condemnation, or self-commendation. I, least of all, feel like boasting about having conducted myself in such a manner in accordance with the ABC rules of the movement, which I always assume are the common knowledge and property of all. It is a source of the keenest disappointment to realize that there are among us leading comrades who either never knew and understood these rules that make for an intelligent and profitable discussion, or who having long known them, unlearned them overnight. Again, this piece is labeled "I Was Unready in 1940," published by written by Max Shachtman, 1943, and from a Workers' Party bulletin circa summer 1943.